Around the year 1300, in the hills of northwestern Anatolia, there was a man named Osman. That sentence is close to the limit of what can be proven about him. No decree of his survives, no letter, no signature. The coins attributed to his lifetime are disputed by the people best qualified to judge them. The man who founded one of the longest ruling dynasties in human history left behind almost nothing a historian can hold and date to the years he was alive. Everything the world knows about Osman was written down more than a century after his death, by court historians employed by his great-great-grandsons, men whose job was not to find out what happened. Their job was to explain why this family deserved the throne it already had. The founder of the House of Osman is, in the documentary record, a rumor. Now look at what the rumor built. At its height, the empire that carried his name ran from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimea to the edge of the Sahara. It held Budapest and Baghdad at the same time. It controlled the Danube, the Nile, and the Euphrates. It owned the two holiest cities in Islam and the largest Christian church on earth in the same decade, and it ruled Athens for longer than Greece has been an independent country. It outlived the Aztec Empire. It outlived the Mughals. It outlived the Spanish Habsburgs, the Venetian Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Romanovs. When it was born, England was fighting with longbows. When it died, it was fighting with machine guns and aircraft. 623 years, 36 sultans, one unbroken family, and it ended in 1922. There are photographs of it, not a painting, not an illustration by a man who was not there. Photographs of the last sultan of a dynasty older than the Ming, walking out of his palace before sunrise. So here is the problem. Ask most people in the English-speaking world what the Ottoman Empire left behind, and the answers stop at about 2. A footstool, maybe. A kind of coffee. An empire that lasted 6 centuries, that touched every life from Bosnia to Basra, that ended within the lifetime of people whose grandchildren are alive right now, has been reduced to furniture. That is not an accident. It is not laziness either. There are reasons a thing this large can disappear this completely. And by the end of this, those reasons will be the most interesting part of the story. But it starts on a frontier, not in a palace, not in a capital, in a place where nobody was entirely certain what anybody else was, where a Greek warlord and a Turkish herder could raid the same village on the same afternoon, on the same side, and neither of them thought that was worth remarking on. That place is the answer to the whole thing. Everything the Ottoman Empire became, and everything that eventually destroyed it, was already sitting in those hills before there was an empire at all. This is the entire history of the Ottoman Empire. To understand how a few hundred horsemen became an empire, start with the corpse they were standing next to. In the year 1300, the Byzantine Empire was still, technically, the Roman Empire, the same state. An unbroken legal line running back to Augustus. Its emperors still used the Roman titles. Its citizens still called themselves Romans, in Greek, and they were not being sentimental about it. They were correct, and it was finished. It had been finished since 1204, when the Fourth Crusade, an army raised to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, ran out of money, took a detour, and sacked Constantinople instead. Christian soldiers looted the greatest Christian city on earth for 3 days. They stripped the bronze from the monuments, melted the statues, and stole the relics. Venice took the horses off the hippodrome and put them on the front of a church, where they still are. The Byzantines got their city back in 1261. They never got the empire back. By 1300, what remained was a capital, some coastline, and a permanent cash shortage, defended by an army that was mostly foreigners hired on credit. Now look east. at Anatolia, and the situation is worse in a different way. In 1243, at a place called Köse, the Mongols destroyed the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had ruled most of Anatolia for a century and a half. The Mongols did not stay to govern. They installed a tribute arrangement, took the money, and left the region to rot without a center. What grew in that vacuum was not a country. It was several dozen small principalities, called beyliks, run by whichever Turkish warlord could hold a valley. They fought the Byzantines. They fought each other more. And along the northwestern edge of Anatolia, where the last Byzantine forts met the first Turkish pastures, there was a strip of land where none of the categories held. This is Bithynia, and it is the most important landscape in this video. The frontier was not a line. It was a zone, perhaps 100 kilometers deep, containing Byzantine garrisons that had not been paid in years, Turkish clans moving herds through the passes, Sufi mystics running lodges that fed anyone who arrived, Greek villagers who paid whoever showed up armed, and warlords of every description who converted, married, betrayed, and allied according to what the month required. Raiding was not a crime here. It was an industry. It was how a man fed his people between harvests, and everyone did it, in every direction. And in this zone, among dozens of similar groups, there was a small clan led by Osman. They were not the largest, not the richest, not the best positioned by any obvious measure. They had one asset, and it was geography. They sat directly on the Byzantine border, which meant two things. Anyone who wanted to raid the richest target in the region had to come through Osman's ground, and anyone who wanted to fight the Byzantines needed Osman's men. Every other beylik in Anatolia was landlocked behind other Turks, fighting other Turks, over the same exhausted valleys. Osman was the door. Here is where this video has to make a decision, and it is going to make it in front of you, because how it gets made determines whether anything that follows can be trusted. The problem is the sources. There is essentially nothing written down at the time. The first Ottoman chronicles date to the 1400s. That is roughly 150 years after Osman. To put that gap in perspective, it is like the founding of the United States being described for the first time by writers working today, with no earlier record, employed by the descendants of the founders, in a country where saying the wrong thing about the founders is a problem. So when the chronicles finally tell the founding story, the story is beautiful, and that is exactly what is wrong with it. The story is called Osman's Dream. Osman is a guest in the house of a Sufi sheikh named Edebali. He is in love with the sheikh's daughter. He sleeps, and he dreams that a moon rises out of the sheikh's chest and sinks into his own. From his own body a tree grows, and it grows until its shade covers the world. And beneath the shade, there are mountains and rivers, and the rivers water the fields of cities with domes and minarets. The wind turns the leaves toward those cities like swords pointing at them. He wakes and tells the sheikh. The sheikh tells him God has given sovereignty to him and to his descendants, and gives him his daughter. It is a perfect founding myth. It has everything. Divine sanction, a holy marriage, a prophecy of empire, the swords, the shade. It is exactly the story a dynasty needs. And it first appears in writing in the late 15th century, when the Ottomans had just taken Constantinople and needed, urgently, an explanation for why God had chosen them over everyone else. So what actually happened? For most of the 20th century, the standard answer was the Gaza thesis, argued by the historian Paul Wittig in 1938. His case was that what drove the early Ottomans was Gaza, an ideology of holy war on the frontier of Islam. Not greed, not land, but faith. The Ottomans, in this reading, were the most committed holy warriors on the frontier. And that ideological engine is why they beat every rival who was only in it for the loot. It is a clean explanation. It held the field for 50 years. Then it got taken apart. The historian Rudi Paul Lindner pointed at something in the sources the thesis could not swallow. Osman's closest companions included a man named Koza Mihal. Koza Mihal was a Byzantine Greek. He was a Christian, and by most accounts, he stayed one for years while riding at Osman's side. You do not bring the infidel with you on the holy war. Lindner's read was blunt. This was about plunder, pasture, and pragmatism, and the holy war vocabulary was painted on afterward by court historians who needed a frontier warband to look like a religious mission. And then a third answer, which is the one this video will use, because it is the one that actually fits the frontier described a few minutes ago. Cemal Kafadar's argument, in a book called Between Two Worlds, is that both camps are hunting for a purity that never existed out there. Wittek wanted real holy warriors. Lindner wanted real cynics. The frontier had neither, because the frontier was a place where the categories were soft by design. Gaza was real language, and it meant something more elastic and more local than a European reading of the word crusade allows. Men could raid for God and for horses in the same afternoon and see no contradiction, because there was none. So here is what this video will tell you, and it is less satisfying than the dream, and it is the truth. The founding story of the Ottoman Empire was written a century and a half late by people who worked for the winners. The single strongest piece of evidence about how they actually operated is not the dream. It is a Christian Greek warlord riding next to the supposed holy warrior, and nobody at the time writing home about how strange that was. Because it was not strange, it was the method. Every other group on that frontier eventually drew a line about who could join. The Ottomans did not. That is the answer to the question this entire video is built on. Not faith, not genius, not even luck, though there was a great deal of luck. Absorption. Hold on to it. It explains the next 600 years, including the ending. Osman died around 1323 or 1324. The date is not certain, which by now should not surprise anyone. What he left his son was still, in institutional terms, a very successful raiding operation. It had men, horses, reputation, and momentum. It had no cities, no treasury, no bureaucracy, and no permanent anything. His son Orhan fixed that, and the fix took years. Bursa sat at the foot of Mount Uludağ, a real Byzantine city with walls a nomad army had no way to break. So Orhan did not break them. He blockaded it. For years. He built forts around it, cut the roads, and waited for the city to run out of everything. It fell in 1326, and the moment it did, the Ottomans stopped being a warband. Bursa became the capital. They struck coins there. They built a mosque complex. They started collecting taxes on a schedule instead of taking things on a raid. A man could now be sent to a place and told to write things down. This sounds like housekeeping. It is the whole game. Every other beylik on that frontier was still doing in 1330 what Osman's clan had been doing in 1300. The Ottomans had just acquired the one thing that turns a war economy into a state: an address and paperwork. Nicaea fell in 1331, Nicomedia in 1337. These are not small towns. Nicaea is where the Christian creed was written. The Byzantines were now losing cities they had no possible way to replace, to an enemy that had figured out how to keep what it took. And then, in 1354, the single luckiest event in Ottoman history. An earthquake hit the Gallipoli Peninsula and wrecked the fortress walls at Gallipoli on the European side of the Dardanelles. The Ottomans, who had been operating in Europe for years as hired help in Byzantine civil wars, walked in and took it. The chroniclers report the earthquake as divine sanction, which is what chroniclers do. Strip the theology out, and the fact remains. A wall fell down, and an Asian power acquired a permanent foothold in Europe. They would hold ground in Europe for the next 568 years. Osman took ground. Orhan took cities. Murad I built the thing that would still be running in 1900. In the 1360s, the Ottomans took Adrianople, the city they would call Edirne. The exact year is disputed in the sources, somewhere between 1361 and 1369, and this video is not going to pretend otherwise. What is not disputed is what happened next, and it is one of the strangest decisions any dynasty ever made. They moved the capital there. Edirne is in Europe. From the 1360s onward, the Ottoman Empire was a European state with an Asian backyard. Its court was in Europe. Its wars were in Europe. Its revenue was largely European, and its elite would soon be born European. Every subsequent century of people describing the Ottomans as an outside force pressing on Europe is describing a state whose capital had been inside Europe for 90 years before it ever took Constantinople. Then Murad did the thing that actually won the Balkans, and it did not involve winning very many battles. He stopped conquering people. The Ottoman method under Murad was vassalage first, annexation later, possibly never. A Serbian lord who submitted kept his land, kept his title, kept his church, his priests, his language, and his local law. What he owed was tribute, and troops when called, and a son sent to the Ottoman court. Think about what that offered a small Balkan noble in 1370. The alternative on the table was a Hungarian Catholic king who would very much like him to stop being Orthodox. The Ottomans did not care what he prayed to. They cared what he paid. So half the Balkans became Ottoman before it was ever conquered. Christian lords rode in Ottoman armies against other Christian lords, under their own banners, keeping their own faith, because the terms were better. That is not tolerance. Nobody was being kind. It was arithmetic. An empire that lets you keep your god costs less to run than one that does not. And an army you did not have to raise is an army you did not have to pay. Which brings us to 3089, and a field called Kosovo Polje. The Field of Blackbirds is one of the most mythologized battles in European history. 600 years later, it is still a live wound in Serbian national memory, invoked in poetry, in liturgy, and in the 1990s, in the speeches that preceded a war. The reality is murkier than any of the versions. Both commanders died. Murad I was killed, reportedly by a Serbian noble who reached him, though the details of how vary enormously depending on the nationality of the source telling you. Prince Lazar was captured and executed. The Serbian army was broken, and the field was Ottoman. And it did not settle anything immediately. Serbia continued to exist as a vassal for decades. The battle that stands in memory as the death of a nation was, on the day, one more bloody engagement in a long campaign. But something did happen on that field that mattered more than the battle, and almost nobody tells it. When word reached Bayezid that his father was dead, he did not mourn first. He had his brother strangled, on the field, that day. Remember that. It is going to stop being a crime and start being a policy, and this video will come back to it. Bayezid I earned his name honestly. Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. He moved armies at speeds Europe did not believe were possible, appearing on frontiers where he had been reported a month's march away. He put Constantinople under blockade and kept it there for years. By 1400, the city was a starving shell, one serious push from ending. The Roman Empire, the actual Roman Empire, was going to be finished 50 years early, by a man in his 30s. Before that, in 1396, Europe made its last serious attempt to stop him. Nicopolis was a real crusade, the kind Europe had not managed to organize in a century. French, Burgundian, German, Hungarian, and English knights. They charged. They rode through the first Ottoman line. They rode up a hill, and at the top they found the Janissaries, the stakes, and Bayezid's cavalry waiting on the flank, which is exactly where Sigismund had told them it would be. The crusade was annihilated. The prisoners were executed in numbers that shocked even the men doing it, and the survivors ransomed for sums that emptied treasuries. After Nicopolis, Europe stopped sending crusades, not for a decade, essentially forever. The idea that the Christian West could raise an army and remove the Ottomans by force died on that hill, and the men who buried it were the same men who had been told exactly how to avoid it. So by 1400, this is the board. The Ottomans hold the Balkans and Western Anatolia. Constantinople is days from falling. Europe has stopped trying. There is no coalition, no rival, no army in the field that can touch Bayezid. And then a man arrives from the east, who has been conquering things that make the Balkans look like a hobby. Timur, Tamerlane. A warlord out of Samarkand who had already broken Persia, sacked Delhi, and built towers out of skulls in cities that had annoyed him. The two men exchanged letters first. They survive in the chronicles, and they read like two enormous egos, discovering the other exists. Timur regarded Bayezid as an upstart border chief with delusions. Bayezid regarded Timur as an interloper with no business in Anatolia. They met at Ankara in July 1402. Bayezid lost everything. The Anatolian troops he had absorbed from the beyliks he had conquered switched sides in the middle of the battle, back to their old lords, who were riding with Timur. The Ottoman army came apart, and Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, the man who had annihilated the last crusade and put Rome itself on the clock, was captured alive. He died in captivity within months. The stories about what Timur did with him, the cage, the footstool, the public humiliation, are almost certainly later inventions by people who enjoyed the image too much to check it. Timur then took what he wanted, handed the Anatolian territories back to the beyliks the Ottomans had swallowed, and went home to plan an invasion of China. He died on the road 2 years later, and his own empire fell apart almost immediately. He had been in Anatolia for less than a year, and in that year he had erased the Ottoman Empire. No sultan, no capital authority, no army. The Anatolian conquests of 100 years handed back in an afternoon. The vassals in Europe watching to see what would happen. And 4 sons, all adults, all with troops, all with acclaim. The Ottoman Empire was over in 1402, 98 years old, one push from Constantinople, deleted by a man who then left and died. So how does a state come back from that? Look at the map in 1403, and the Ottoman Empire should not exist by 1420. Everything east of the Straits has been handed back to the beyliks. The treasury is gone, the Sultan is dead in a foreign prison. And the 4 sons of Bayezid, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, are dividing what is left and preparing to kill each other for it. They spent 11 years doing exactly that. The Ottomans call it the Fetret Devri, the interregnum. Suleiman held Europe from Edirne. Mehmed held northern Anatolia. Isa and Musa held pieces and made moves. They allied, betrayed, and destroyed each other in a sequence the sources cannot fully agree on, which is why this video is going to give you the shape rather than invent the detail. Suleiman was killed. Isa disappeared. Musa turned on Mehmed. Mehmed won in 1413. and became Mehmed I. 11 years of civil war, 4 claimants, no central authority, an empire cut in half by a mountain range and a sea. Now the actual question, the one that matters, where was everybody else? Because the Byzantines were sitting in Constantinople, which the Ottomans had been strangling for a decade, with a hostile power now in total collapse across the water. Venice had a fleet, Hungary had an army and a border. Serbia and Bulgaria had every reason on earth to want the Ottomans gone. The Anatolian beyliks had just been handed their lands back by Timur and had 100 years of grievance to settle. For 11 years, the Ottoman state had no functioning center, and it had enemies on every side who all wanted it dead, and not one of them finished it. Here is what they did instead. They backed brothers. Byzantium hosted claimants and picked favorites. The Serbian despot fought for one brother against another. Venice negotiated with whoever held the coast that year. Every single power that could have removed the Ottomans permanently instead invested in installing a friendly one. The reason is not stupidity, and this is the fact that should reframe the entire century for you. By 1402, everyone in the region was already dependent on the Ottoman state. The Byzantine emperor needed Ottoman troops for his own civil wars, and had for 50 years. The Balkan lords needed Ottoman protection against Hungary more than they needed independence from Edirne. Venice needed Ottoman ports open and Ottoman grain moving. The whole region had spent a century organizing its economy and its politics around the assumption that there would be an Ottoman power to deal with. A dead Ottoman Empire was not a prize. It was a vacuum, and every one of them was more frightened of the vacuum than of the Turks. So they did not kill it. They shopped in it. Mehmed I spent his reign, 1413 to 1421, gluing it back together, and he did it with a patience his father would have found unbearable. He took the Anatolian territories back mostly by diplomacy and marriage, rather than by war. He restored the treasury. He rebuilt the administration. He did not conquer very much, and he did not need to. The lesson to take out of the interregnum, and it will be true again in 1683 and in 1878 and in 1918, is this. The Ottoman Empire never once died because someone killed it. Every time it should have died, it survived because the people who could have finished it could not agree on what would replace it. Hold that. It is the exact reason it lasts another 500 years. It is also the exact reason that the ending, when it finally comes from the inside. Murad II took the throne in 1421 and inherited something his grandfather never had, a rebuilt state with institutions, chief among them the Janissaries. They appear here as a fact, and the mechanism gets explained properly later, because the mechanism deserves its own chapter, and it is going to get one. For now, the fact. A standing professional infantry corps, salaried, barracked, drilled year-round, equipped with gunpowder weapons early and well. In an age when European armies were feudal levies, who went home for the harvest, and knights who treated orders as suggestions, the Ottomans had a permanent army that trained in peacetime and did what it was told. There was nothing like it in Europe. There would not be for 200 years. Murad used it, and by the 1440s the empire was back to full strength and pushing again, which brought one more crusade, the last one that was ever going to be serious. In 1444, the Ottomans and the Hungarians signed a truce at Szeged. It was sworn. Then a papal legate arrived and made an argument that an oath sworn to an infidel does not bind a Christian, and the Christian side broke it and marched. They met at Varna, on the Black Sea coast, in November 1444. Murad, who had actually retired, had to be dragged back to fight it. He had abdicated in favor of his 12-year-old son and gone to Anatolia to sit with mystics and read, and the state promptly discovered that a 12-year-old cannot hold an empire together with a crusade coming. They sent for him, he came back. The chronicles say he carried the broken treaty on a lance at Varna and held it up to heaven and asked the Christian God what he thought of it. That story is very likely improved in the telling. The battle was not. The Hungarian and Polish king Vladislav charged the Janissary line personally, trying to reach Murad and end it in one stroke. He did not reach him. His head went on a spear, and Varna became the last time Europe raised an army with the specific purpose of destroying the Ottoman Empire. And now the part of this act that actually matters, which is not the battle. Murad went back to Anatolia. He was pulled out of retirement a second time, in 1446, because the boy still could not hold it. The Janissaries had rioted. The court had split. The state had, twice now, looked at the heir and gone over his head to his father. Picture what that does to a 14-year-old. He is the Sultan. He has been publicly, twice, judged insufficient by his own government. His father has been fetched to fix what he broke. Everyone at court knows it. Everyone in Europe knows it. And every ambassador who writes home describes him as a boy who is not up to it. Murad II died in 1451. The boy took the throne again, this time for good, at 19. The ambassadors filed the same reports. Young, untested, unimpressive. Venice and Genoa read them and relaxed. The Byzantines read them and decided this was a good moment to make demands, and sent a message to the new sultan, implying that the Ottoman claimant they were holding as a hostage might become expensive to keep quiet. They had reason to feel safe. The walls of their city had been standing since the 5th century. 23 armies had tried them. 23 had failed. Attila did not take that city. The Arabs did not take it, twice. Bayezid the Thunderbolt could not take it in 10 years of trying. The humiliated boy read their message and made no fuss about it at all. His name was Mehmed. Before Mehmed, the walls. Because you cannot understand what he did, without understanding what everyone in the world knew to be true before he did it, and what nobody in the world believed afterward. The Theodosian walls went up in the 5th century. They are not a wall, they are a system, an outer moat, 20 meters wide, that could be flooded. Behind it, a low outer wall with its own parapet. Behind that, a terrace. Behind that, the great inner wall, 12 meters high and 5 meters thick, studded with 96 towers, each one a fortress in itself. An attacker who took the moat had to take the outer wall while being shot at from the inner wall above it. An attacker who took the outer wall found himself in a killing terrace with nowhere to go. For 1,000 years, that system was the most successful piece of military engineering on earth. 23 sieges. Attila the Hun looked at those walls and went to attack Italy instead. The Avars failed. The Persians failed. The Arabs failed twice, in the 7th century and the 8th, and the second failure broke the momentum of the Umayyad Caliphate. The Bulgars failed. The Rus failed. Bayezid the Thunderbolt sat outside them for years and starved the city half to death and never got in. The only army that ever took Constantinople before 1453 was the Fourth Crusade. And they came in from the harbor side, through the sea walls, from ships, against a city that had opened its own gates to them as allies first. So when a 19-year-old took the Ottoman throne in 1451 and announced that he intended to take the city, the reaction in every court in Europe and every barracks in his own empire was roughly the same. It had been tried. It did not work. His first act as Sultan tells you what kind of man was making the announcement. He had his infant half-brother drowned in a bath. not a rival, not a threat, an infant. The child's mother was, according to the chronicles, received by Mehmed the same day with formal courtesy, and the man who carried out the killing was then executed for having done it. That is not rage. Rage is Bayezid on the field at Kosovo, with his brother's body cooling behind him. This is administration. Mehmed did the arithmetic every Ottoman Sultan had been doing since 1389, arrived at the answer the state kept arriving at, and had it done before lunch by a man he then disposed of to keep the arithmetic clean. The Ottoman Empire was starting to institutionalize murder as a succession policy. It is going to get worse, and it is going to get written into law. And when it does, this video is going to explain exactly why. Because the reason is not what you think. Now the city. The strategic case for taking Constantinople was total, and it did not require obsession to see. The Ottomans held Europe. The Ottomans held Anatolia. And directly between them, at the narrowest and most valuable point on earth, sat a foreign capital they did not control, with a harbor that could host any fleet that wanted to cut their empire in half. Every Ottoman army crossing between its own two halves crossed under the guns of a city that was legally an enemy. Every Ottoman Sultan had to negotiate with a Byzantine emperor who had, at any given moment, a spare Ottoman prince in a comfortable room, ready to be released into Anatolia to start a civil war. That was the Byzantine strategy in its last century. Not an army, a hostage. They had no other cards left, and they played that one constantly. So Mehmed's first move was not against the city, it was against the water. In 1452, at the narrowest point of the Bosphorus, on the European shore, on land that was not his, he built a fortress, Rumeli Hisaru, 3 enormous towers and connecting walls, and he built it in under 5 months, which is a speed that European engineers of the period would have called impossible. Directly across the water was an older Ottoman fort on the Asian side. Together, the two of them closed the strait. A Venetian ship came down from the Black Sea and declined to stop and be inspected. Mehmed's guns sank it. The survivors who made it ashore were executed, and the captain was impaled and left on the bank where every ship coming down the strait could see him. The message required no interpreter. The Bosphorus is closed. Constantinople can no longer be fed from the Black Sea. The city that had survived 23 sieges by being resupplied by water had just had the water taken away, by a fortress built in 5 months, by a boy the ambassadors had called unimpressive. Then he went looking for a gun. The man who found him first was a Hungarian named Orban. He was a cannon founder, and he was very good, and he had gone to the Byzantine emperor first, which is a detail worth sitting with. He offered Constantine XI a bombard of a size nobody had built. Constantine could not pay him. The Roman Empire, in its last year, could not afford the artillery that was being offered to it. So Orban walked across the lines and offered the same to Mehmed, who asked whether the gun could break the walls of Constantinople. The reported answer is that it could break the walls of Babylon. Mehmed paid him 4 times what he asked and gave him everything he needed. The gun that came out of the foundry at Edirne is called the Basilica. The chroniclers describe something over 8 meters long, firing stone balls of something in the region of half a ton, with a bore a man could crawl into. Every one of those figures comes from writers who had a strong interest in the thing being enormous, so treat the specific numbers as a range rather than a measurement. What is not in doubt is the scale, because moving it was itself a documented logistical operation. It took teams of oxen in the dozens and a road crew going ahead of it to strengthen the bridges, and it traveled at the speed of a slow walk for weeks. It was a terrible weapon by any modern standard. It could be fired a handful of times a day. It had to cool, or it would crack. It cracked anyway. It killed its own crews. None of that mattered, because the entire logic of the Theodosian walls, and of every wall built in the previous 1,000 years, rested on one assumption: building a wall is cheaper than knocking it down. That assumption is what made the medieval world work. It is why a lord with a castle and 40 men could ignore a king with 4,000. It is why Constantinople survived every empire that came at it. In the spring of 1453, that assumption stopped being true, and it never became true again. Within a century, every castle in Europe was decoration. The whole military architecture of the Middle Ages was made obsolete not by an idea, but by a foundry, and the demonstration happened on the oldest and best walls anyone had ever built. The siege began in April 1453. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, had somewhere in the region of 7,000 men to hold 14 miles of fortification. The exact number is small enough that the sources broadly agree on it, which is unusual, and which tells you something about how thoroughly the defenders had counted. Of those men, a significant portion were foreigners. Genoese under a professional soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who had come with 700 men at his own expense. Venetians, some of whom stayed because their ships were trapped in the harbor. A handful of Spaniards, one Scot, according to one account. Against them, the Ottoman figures run from 50,000 to 200,000, depending on which chronicler you believe. And the chroniclers on both sides had reasons to inflate. The low, defensible end is enormous enough. Assume something in the tens of thousands and the arithmetic still works out to at least 10 attackers for every defender, with an artillery train nobody had ever faced. Constantine walked the walls at night. Every account mentions it. He walked them because there were not enough men to hold them and everybody knew it, and because the only resource he had left was the sight of the emperor still standing there at 3 in the morning. The Byzantines had one thing that still worked. The Golden Horn is the harbor. It is a deep inlet running up the side of the city, and the seawall along it was the weakest fortification Constantinople had, because it had never needed to be strong. Across the mouth of the Horn, the Byzantines had strung a great iron chain, floated on logs, anchored at both ends. No fleet could get through it. The Ottoman navy sat outside and could do nothing, and while the Horn stayed closed, the defenders could leave that whole flank thinly held. On the 22nd of April, the Byzantines woke up and found Ottoman ships inside the harbor. Mehmed had built a road, overland, out of the Bosphorus, over the ridge behind Galata, and down into the Horn. Timber tracks, greased with animal fat, and teams of oxen and men hauling warships over a hill in a single night. Something in the region of 70 ships, though the number varies, appeared in a harbor they could not possibly be in. Militarily, it was not decisive on its own. Strategically, it was ruinous. The defenders now had to man the sea wall along the Horn, and they did not have the men, so they took them off the land walls, where the guns were. The Ottomans put a pontoon bridge across the Horn afterward, because the point had been made, and there was no reason to be subtle about it. Inside the city, the defense was doing what doomed alliances do. The Genoese and the Venetians, who had spent 2 centuries fighting each other over trade, argued about who was pulling weight. The Genoese colony at Galata, across the Horn, stayed officially neutral and traded with both sides, which is exactly what a trading colony does, and exactly what nobody in the city was ever going to forgive. The final assault came before dawn on the 29th of May. Mehmed sent them in waves, and he sent the worst first. Irregulars, the Bashi Bazouks, unpaid men who fought for plunder, thrown at the walls to exhaust the defenders and use up their ammunition. Then, the Anatolian regulars. Then, when the defenders had been fighting without relief for hours, the Janissaries. Two things broke the city, and neither of them was the great gun. The first is a small gate called the Kerkerporta. The accounts say it was a sally port, used for a counterattack, and left unlocked. Ottoman troops found it and got inside the outer defenses and put a flag up on the tower above it. The second is that Giustiniani was hit. He had been holding the most critical sector for 50 days, and he had been the spine of the defense. He was wounded, badly, and he asked to be carried out. Constantine reportedly begged him to stay in sight, even if he could not fight. He was carried through the gate to a ship. His men saw him go. And the defense, which had held for 7 weeks against 10-1 odds, came apart in an hour, because the men on that wall had been holding because he was holding, and he was not there anymore. The Ottomans came over the wall. The Genoese broke for the harbor. The Venetians died mostly where they stood. Constantine XI, the 188th and last emperor of the Romans, is reported to have taken off the purple regalia so he could not be identified, and gone into the line as an ordinary soldier. His body was never identified. There is no tomb. The Roman Empire, an institution that had existed continuously since Augustus, ends with a man in unmarked armor whose corpse nobody ever found. The sack lasted 3 days, which was the custom of the age, and which Mehmed had promised his army, because armies of that era did not storm cities for wages. It was what you would expect, and this video is not going to dwell on it for entertainment. Thousands were killed. Tens of thousands were enslaved. The churches were stripped. The city that had been the wealthiest in Christendom for 1,000 years was emptied of everything portable. Mehmed rode in on the first day and went to the Hagia Sophia. The building was 916 years old. For every one of those years it had been the largest cathedral in the world. There was no second place. He ordered it converted to a mosque, and he ordered it preserved. That distinction is the whole rest of the story, and this is where most tellings stop, and where this one starts. Because here is the thing about the 29th of May, 1453. It is the most famous day in Ottoman history, and it is not the most important thing Mehmed did that year. What he did next was, Constantinople in June 1453 was not a prize. It was a ruin. The population had been declining for 250 years. Before the siege, it was perhaps 50,000 people, rattling around inside walls built for something approaching 1 million, with fields and orchards growing inside the city because there were not enough people to fill the blocks. After the sack and the enslavements, it was less. Mehmed had just conquered the greatest city on earth, and it was an empty shell, and an empty shell was worth nothing to him. So he repopulated it by decree, not by invitation, by order. He issued sürgün, forced resettlement, and moved populations into the city from all over the empire. Greeks from Anatolia, Armenians from the east, Serbs from the Balkans, Turks from everywhere, Jews. He gave them houses. He gave them tax exemptions. He compelled merchants and craftsmen to relocate and open shops. And where compulsion was not enough, he made the terms good enough that people came anyway. Within a generation, Constantinople was one of the largest cities in the world again, and it was more diverse than it had been under the Byzantines. Then he did the thing that nobody expects. He rebuilt the Orthodox Church. The Patriarchate had been vacant. Mehmed personally selected and installed a new patriarch, a monk named Gennadios Scholarios, and Gennadios was not chosen at random. He was the leader of the faction that had spent the last decades violently opposing union with the Catholic Church of Rome. Mehmed invested him personally, in a ceremony deliberately modeled on the Byzantine imperial one, and confirmed the church's rights over its people. Read that again, because it sounds like a mistake. The Muslim conqueror who had just sacked the greatest Christian city on earth, then personally reinstalled its church, chose its leader, and guaranteed its authority over its congregation. Why? Because a functioning Orthodox hierarchy under his control was worth infinitely more to him than a converted one. He had just acquired a Christian majority. He had held a Christian majority in the Balkans for a century. He needed those people governed, taxed, and quiet. And the cheapest way to do that was through the institution they already obeyed, with a leader who owed his chair to the Sultan. And because Gennadios and his faction hated Rome more than they hated the Turks. That was not a Turkish theory. It was Byzantine policy. In the last decades of the empire, the phrase circulating in Constantinople, attributed to the Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, was that it would be better to see the Sultan's turban in the city than the Latin mitre. Whether he said it in those words or not, thousands of Orthodox Christians agreed with the sentiment, because they remembered 1004, when it was the Catholics who sacked them. Mehmed did not have to invent that division. He inherited it, and he built an institution on top of it that would still be running 450 years later. The system that grew out of that decision is called the millet system, and it is one of the 2 or 3 most important things in this entire video. And it is going to get explained properly in its own chapter, because you cannot understand either the empire's success or its death without it. Then, having taken the Roman capital and reinstalled the Roman Church, Mehmed did the only thing left. He claimed the title, Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome. Europe found it grotesque. But look at the claim on its own terms, which is what an Ottoman jurist would have done. The Roman Empire is not a place, it is an office, and it moves. It moved from Rome to Constantinople in 330, and nobody argued it stopped being Roman. Whoever holds the city and the church and the throne holds the office. Mehmed held the city. He held the church, having just appointed its head. And there was no rival claimant alive, because the last one had died in unmarked armor in a gate. He also married into the remaining Byzantine aristocracy and took Byzantine officials into his administration because he was not being ironic. He believed he was the Roman emperor, and he behaved like a man who intended to have the rest of the empire back, and he moved on Italy to get it. Europe never accepted the claim, and the refusal is not a footnote. For the next 400 years, European writing about the Ottomans is built on a foundational insistence that these people are outsiders, Orientals, a foreign body pressing on Christendom from beyond, and that everything about them is alien. That story is why an empire whose capital was in Europe for 568 years, whose grand viziers were born Christian in Balkan villages, and whose sultan claimed the Roman throne with a straight face, ends up remembered in the English-speaking world as a piece of furniture. The erasure did not start in 1922. It started in 1453 as policy in Rome. And here is the detail that puts it beyond argument. In 1479, Mehmed wrote to Venice and asked them to send him a portrait painter. Venice sent Gentile Bellini, one of the finest artists in Europe. Bellini lived at the Ottoman court and painted the Sultan's portrait in the Italian style, in 3/4 profile under a Renaissance arch. The man who ended the Roman Empire hired a Venetian to paint him like a Renaissance prince, because he thought of himself as one, and the painting is in the National Gallery in London today, and you can go and stand in front of it. The rest of the reign runs fast. Serbia annexed, Bosnia taken, the Morea, Trebizond, the last Greek splinter state on the Black Sea, extinguished. The Crimean Khanate accepted as a vassal in 1475, which turns the Black Sea into an Ottoman lake and gives the empire a Tatar cavalry reservoir it will use for 300 years. Wallachia contested with a vassal prince called Vlad III, whose reputation in Ottoman sources is exactly what his reputation in every other source is, and who is worth precisely one sentence in this video, because he is worth about that much in this story. In 1480, Ottoman troops landed at Otranto, in the heel of Italy, and took it. Rome began evacuating. The Pope made plans to leave. In 1481, Mehmed the Conqueror set out from Istanbul at the head of an army and died on the road, aged 49, and nobody knows where he was going. Rome believed he was going to Rome. The Otranto garrison withdrew, and Italy exhaled. Whether he was poisoned is a rumor that has been repeated for 500 years and cannot be confirmed. He left his son an empire that had a Christian capital, a Christian majority in its European heartland, an Orthodox church on the state payroll, a claim to the Roman throne, and an official religion of Islam. Nobody had ever run that combination. There was no manual. The next man to hold it did not care for manuals. Selim I is the only Ottoman sultan who took the throne by forcing his own father off it, and lived. Get there in a moment. First, the reign nobody covers. Bayezid II ruled for 31 years, and the standard verdict is that he was the quiet one between the conqueror and the grim. That verdict is lazy. Bayezid spent 3 decades doing the thing empires die from neglecting, which is consolidation. He codified law. He rebuilt Istanbul after the earthquake of 1509, which was so severe it is remembered as the Lesser Judgment Day. He built a navy that his grandson would use to own the Mediterranean. And in 1492, he did something that tells you more about how this empire actually worked than any battle in this act. In 1492, Spain, having completed the Reconquista, expelled its Jews. Somewhere in the region of 100,000 people were given months to convert or leave, and the wealth they could not carry was taken. Bayezid sent ships. The Ottoman navy sailed to Spanish ports and carried Sephardic Jews to Ottoman territory, and the state settled them in Istanbul, in Edirne, and above all in Salonika, and gave them the right to their own courts, their own schools, their own language, their own rabbis. There is a line attributed to Bayezid, mocking Ferdinand of Aragon as a fool for impoverishing his own kingdom in order to enrich the Ottoman one. It is quoted everywhere, and the sourcing for it is thin, so treat it as a story the Ottomans told about themselves, rather than as a transcript. But you do not need the quote, because the policy is documented, and the policy says the same thing, and the policy was not charity. Spain had just expelled its physicians, its bankers, its printers, its merchants, and its craftsmen. Bayezid took delivery of them. Salonika became a majority Jewish city. It stayed a majority Jewish city for 4 centuries. Ladino, the Spanish of 1492, was still being spoken in the streets of that city in the 20th century, 500 years after the country that spoke it had thrown them out. Remember Salonika. This video will come back to it twice, and the second time is the worst thing in it. Meanwhile, Bayezid had a brother. Cem had fought him for the throne, lost and fled, first to the Mamluks in Egypt, and then to the Knights of St. John on Rhodes, who understood immediately what had landed in their harbor. They did not free him, and they did not kill him. They rented him. Cem was passed from the Knights to the King of France to the Pope, and for 13 years, the Ottoman Empire paid an annual subsidy, tens of thousands of ducats a year, to keep him locked up. Sit with the picture. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful man in the Mediterranean, sending gold to the Vatican every year, on schedule, so that the Pope will continue to imprison the Sultan's own brother, because the alternative is the Pope letting him go into Anatolia with a French army and starting a civil war. That is what a spare prince was worth. That is the price of an unresolved succession, paid in cash, annually, for 13 years, to your worst enemy. Hold that thought for about 4 minutes. Bayezid grew old, and his sons grew impatient, and the youngest was the problem. Selim was a provincial governor on the eastern frontier, and he was not the favorite, and he did not intend to lose. He got the Janissaries onto his side, because the Janissaries wanted a sultan who would fight, and Bayezid had not campaigned in years. In 1512, Selim marched on the capital, and Bayezid abdicated in his favor rather than fight him. Bayezid died a few weeks later, on the road to retirement. Poison is alleged in the sources and cannot be proven, and it should be reported exactly that way, because there is no version of Ottoman history where you get to stop reporting it that way. Then Selim did the thing his name is for. He killed his brothers. He killed his nephews. He killed, by most accounts, every male of the line who could conceivably have made a claim, including children. And now this video is going to explain why. Because the explanation is not cruelty. And if you take away only one uncomfortable idea from these 2 hours, this should be it. In 1389, Bayezid strangled his brother on the field at Kosovo, before his father's body was cold. That looked like passion. In 1402, Bayezid lost a battle and left 4 adult sons, and the empire spent 11 years in a civil war, so total that 4 claimants ruled 4 fragments, and every neighbor got to pick a favorite. For 13 years after that, the empire paid the Pope to hold Sem, because one loose prince was worth an annual tribute to the Vatican. The Ottoman state had now run the experiment 3 times, and the results were in. Fratricide costs 1 life. A contested succession costs a decade of civil war, an entire generation of gains, and hands every enemy a claimant to sponsor. So the empire wrote it into law. Mehmed II's law code, the Kanunname, contains a clause permitting the sultan who takes the throne to have his brothers killed for the good of the world order, the Nizam Alem. It cites the jurists. It is not a secret, and it was not shameful. It was published policy, and it was defended, in writing, as the lesser evil. That is the horror of it. This is not a barbaric dynasty being barbaric. This is a rational state, staffed by lawyers, looking at 11 years of civil war and the Vatican's invoice, and concluding, on the evidence, that murdering an infant in a bath is cheaper than the alternative. They were not even wrong about the arithmetic. That is the part that should keep you up. And when they eventually stop doing it, in the 17th century, and replace it with something that looks more humane, the replacement will be worse. That is later. Now Selim's 8 years, and the 2 campaigns that doubled the empire and set the borders of the modern Middle East. The first is East. A new power had risen in Persia. The Safavids, under a young Shah named Ismail, and they were Shia, and they were not quiet about it. Ismail was converting Iran by force, and he was doing something much more dangerous to the Ottomans than that. He was preaching into Anatolia. The Turkmen tribes of eastern Anatolia, the Ottomans' own subjects, were listening. They had more in common with the Safavid message than with the increasingly bureaucratic Sunni empire in Istanbul, and they were rising. This is the only kind of enemy that could actually kill the Ottoman state in 1514, not an army on the border, a rival claim to the loyalty of its own people. Selim marched east and did 2 things. The first was a massacre and purge of Safavid sympathizers inside Anatolia, on a scale the sources put in the tens of thousands. The second was Chaldiran. In August 1514, the 2 armies met on a plain in eastern Anatolia. The Safavid army was cavalry, superb cavalry, the finest horsemen in the region, and Ismail believed his men were spiritually invulnerable and behaved accordingly. The Ottoman army had cannon chained together in a line, and janissaries with matchlocks behind them. The Safavid cavalry charged the guns. It was not a battle, it was a demonstration. Ismail was wounded, his harem was captured, his aura of invincibility was destroyed, and he reportedly never personally led an army again. And here is what came out of that day and never left. The Ottomans could not hold Persia. The distance was too great, and the logistics did not work. So the frontier stabilized roughly where the guns had stopped. Sunni Ottoman power on one side, Shia Safavid power on the other. The two states then spent 2 centuries fighting along that seam, and each one hardened its own religious identity in opposition to the other, because that is what a permanent enemy does to you. The Sunni and Shia border in the Middle East today runs, very approximately, where Selim's artillery line stopped in 1514. That division is old, and it is theological, and this video is not going to pretend a canon invented it. But the political border, the hard one, the one that puts a Shia state here and a Sunni state there, and makes Iraq the place where they grind against each other, is a fossil of an artillery position from the summer of 1514. Then Selim turned south, and in under a year, he doubled the empire. The Mamluk Sultanate had ruled Egypt and Syria for 250 years. They were the most prestigious military caste in the Islamic world. They had beaten the Mongols at Ain Jalut. They had finished the Crusader states. They were slave soldiers of the most refined kind, and they fought on horseback, brilliantly, with lances and bows. They also thought firearms were dishonorable, and refused to build a proper corps of them. At Marj Dabik, north of Aleppo, in August 1516, the Ottoman guns and the Janissary muskets destroyed the Mamluk army and killed the Mamluk Sultan. Syria fell in weeks. At Ridania, outside Cairo, in January 1517, they did it again. In under a year, the Ottoman Empire acquired Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and the Hejaz, Aleppo, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, which was the largest city in the Islamic world, and Mecca and Medina. The Sharif of Mecca sent Selim the keys. The Ottoman Sultan became the custodian of the 2 holy mosques, protector of the Hajj, and the guarantor of the pilgrimage routes, which is not a ceremonial title. It is the single most legitimating role available anywhere in Sunni Islam, and it came with the responsibility of feeding and defending several 100,000 pilgrims a year across a desert. The empire had been a Balkan power with Anatolian holdings and a Roman capital. It was now, in addition, the leading power of the Arab world and the guardian of Islam's holiest ground, and it would be for 400 years, which is why the collapse in 1918 does not just redraw Turkey. It redraws everything from Baghdad to Jerusalem to Mecca, and this video will be there when it happens. Now the false fact. You will be told, in books and documentaries and on this platform constantly, that in 1517, the last Abbasid Caliph, a figurehead the Mamluks had kept in Cairo, formally transferred the caliphate to Selim in a ceremony in the Hagia Sophia, and that this is how the Ottoman sultans became caliphs. That story is almost certainly a later construction. There is no good contemporary evidence of a formal ceremony of transfer. The dramatic version of it appears much later, largely in the 18th century, at precisely the moment the Ottomans had a diplomatic use for a formal claim to universal Muslim authority, specifically in negotiations with Russia over Muslims living under Russian rule. What actually happened is slower and more interesting. Ottoman sultans had used caliphal language loosely for a long time, as many Muslim rulers did. After 1517, the claim got much stronger because the facts got much stronger, since a man who holds Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem does not need a certificate. And then centuries later, when the empire was weak and needed leverage, the claim was retroactively given a founding ceremony it does not appear to have had. This is exactly the same operation as Osman's dream. A dynasty in need of legitimacy commissions a founding moment and backdates it. The Ottomans did it at the beginning, and they did it in the middle, and by now, if you have been paying attention, you should be suspicious of every clean story in this video, and this video should have earned that from you. Selim the Grim died in 1520 of an infection after 8 years on the throne. He had killed his brothers and their sons. He had broken Persia's momentum, destroyed the Mamluks, doubled the empire's territory, filled the treasury with Egyptian revenue, and taken custody of the holy cities. And he left exactly one son, no brothers to kill, no claimants, no civil war, no annual invoice to the Vatican, a full treasury, the best army in the world, an unchallenged frontier in the East, and every Ottoman institution running at peak efficiency, handed cleanly to a 25-year-old who had to do nothing to get it. It is the luckiest inheritance in the history of the dynasty. His own people would name him Kanuni, the lawgiver. Europe would call him something else. Start at Mohacs, 2 hours after it ended. The 29th of August, 1526. A flooded plain in southern Hungary. Somewhere in the reeds and the mud, there is a stream, and in that stream, under his own horse, face down in the water, is Louis II, King of Hungary and Bohemia, 20 years old, drowned in armor while fleeing a battle that had lasted about 2 hours. Around him is the Hungarian army, and the Hungarian nobility, and the Hungarian church. The archbishops died with the knights. The Kingdom of Hungary had existed for over 500 years, and it had been the shield of Central Europe, and the wall the Ottomans had broken themselves against for a century and a half. It ceased to function in an afternoon. That is what the reign of Suleiman looks like from the outside. Now build it properly from the start, because the reign is 46 years long, and everyone tells the first half. He took the throne in 1520, and Europe, once again, filed the wrong report. The ambassadors described a mild young man, a scholar, a poet, a relief after the grim. Venice reported that he was gentle and not much interested in war. In his first full campaigning season, he took Belgrade. Belgrade was not a town. It was the gate. It sat at the junction of the Sava and the Danube, and whoever held it controlled the road into Central Europe. Mehmed the Conqueror had besieged it and failed. It had held out against the Ottomans for 70 years. It fell in 1521, in the new Sultan's first year, and the road to Hungary was open. The next year he took Rhodes. The Knights of St. John were the last crusading order still functioning, the same men who had rented Sem to the Pope a generation earlier. They had held Rhodes for 200 years, and it was the most heavily fortified place in the eastern Mediterranean, and from it they raided Ottoman shipping and the pilgrim route to Egypt, which after 1517 was no longer an annoyance, but an attack on the Sultan's duty as guardian of the Hajj. Suleiman besieged Rhodes for 6 months, and it cost him enormously, and it fell in December 1522, and then he let them go. The surviving knights were permitted to leave with their weapons, their relics, and their honors. Suleiman gave them ships. It was a magnificent gesture, in the exact sense of the word Europe would attach to him. It was also the single worst strategic decision of his life, and he lived long enough to find out, because those knights went to Malta, and in 1565 they broke an Ottoman army there, and this video will come back to that. Then Hungary. Mohacs in 1526 did not just destroy an army. It killed the king without an heir, and it detonated the succession. Half the Hungarian nobility elected a Hungarian, John Zapolya. The other half elected Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So Hungary partitioned itself into a Habsburg piece, an Ottoman piece, and a vassal piece, and the Ottoman Empire acquired a permanent land border with the House of Habsburg. That border is the defining fact of European geopolitics for the next 150 years. Two enormous empires, both claiming universal authority, grinding along a line through the Hungarian plain, in a war that never quite ends and never quite escalates, generation after generation, forever. And in 1529, Suleiman went for Vienna itself. The siege failed. And the reason it failed is the most important sentence in this act, and it is not the one the Viennese would prefer. Vienna did not beat the Ottoman army in 1529. The calendar did. An Ottoman campaign began when the grass in Thrace was high enough to feed the horses, which meant late spring. It had to be home before the autumn rains turned the Balkan roads into a swamp that would swallow the artillery train, which meant leaving by roughly September. That gave the Sultan about 5 months of campaigning, and the march from Istanbul to Vienna ate most of it before a shot was fired. In 1529, the rains came early and heavily. The roads collapsed. The heavy siege artillery, the guns that made Ottoman sieges work, had to be abandoned somewhere in the mud of the Balkans. The army that arrived at Vienna arrived late, wet, and without the one thing that had taken Constantinople. They tried mining instead. They failed. It began to snow in October, in Austria, with the supply line running back to Istanbul, and Suleiman went home. So the empire had just discovered its own radius. Vienna is roughly the furthest point from Istanbul, at which a 16th century Ottoman army could arrive with its guns, fight, and get home before winter killed it. That is not a failure of courage or of generalship. It is arithmetic, oxen, and rain. And the empire spent the next 150 years refusing to accept it. They came back in 1532 and got no further. They came back in 1683 with the same problem and got the same answer, and that time the answer cost them the Hungarian plain forever. An empire that has found its own limit has a choice. It can restructure itself around the limit, or it can keep throwing armies at it. The Ottomans knew where the line was by 1529, and every institution they had was built for expansion. And none of those institutions could be told that the expansion was over. Now the sea. While the army was learning where its edge was, the navy was doing the opposite, and it was doing it with a man the state had no business hiring. Hayreddin, called Barbarossa, was a corsair. He and his brother had built a pirate operation out of the North African coast that had turned into a small state at Algiers. He was not a nobleman, not a janissary, not a devshirme recruit, not a member of any Ottoman institution. In 1533, Suleiman summoned him to Istanbul and made him Capudan Pasha, admiral of the Ottoman fleet. The state hired the pirate and handed him the navy. That is absorption, again, and it is the same move Osman made with Köse Mihal on the frontier 230 years earlier. There was no class the man could not come from, no origin that disqualified him, and no aristocracy to be offended, because the Ottomans had made sure there was no aristocracy at all. If you were the best sailor in the Mediterranean was yours to run. Compare that to what would have happened to an Algerian pirate presenting himself at the court of Charles V. Barbarossa rebuilt the fleet, and in 1538, at Preveza, he beat a Holy League armada under Andrea Doria, the best admiral Christendom had, funded by the Pope, crewed by Venice, Genoa, and Spain. The Eastern Mediterranean became an Ottoman sea and stayed that way for a generation. What that meant in practice was ugly, and this video is not going to skip it. The corsair economy ran on slave raiding, Ottoman and North African galleys took people off the coasts of Italy, Spain, and the Greek islands in numbers that emptied stretches of shoreline and drove Mediterranean populations inland, and those raids reached as far as Iceland in the following century. It also has to be said once, and then moved past, that this was not an Ottoman peculiarity. The Knights of Malta ran the identical business in the opposite direction, with the same enthusiasm and the same galleys and the same chained rowers. Every naval power in that sea was in the human trafficking business, and the difference between a corsair and a navy was who had issued the paperwork. And in the middle of all this, the strangest alliance in European history. France, the most Catholic kingdom on earth, the eldest daughter of the Church, allied itself with the Muslim Sultan against the Catholic Habsburgs, because Francis I was more afraid of Charles V than of anyone in Istanbul. It went further than diplomacy. In 1543, the Ottoman fleet under Barbarossa wintered at Toulon, and the French cleared out the town to accommodate them. And there was an Ottoman naval base on the coast of France, with a call to prayer over a French port for a season. Christendom versus Islam is a story Europe told about this period. It is not what the period was. The period was Habsburg versus Valois, and one of the players hired the Ottomans. Now the thing his own people named him for. Europe called him Suleiman the Magnificent because of the gold, the armies, and the ceremony. The Ottomans called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. And the difference between those two names is the difference between how the empire looked and how it worked. Suleiman did not mostly invent new law. He did something less cinematic and more consequential. He took the accumulated legal chaos of 250 years and made it a system. The problem he had is genuinely hard. An Islamic empire has Sharia, which is divine, and which cannot be legislated by a sultan because it is not his to legislate. But an empire also needs administrative law, land tenure, taxation, criminal penalties, market regulation, the status of non-Muslims, the rules for a Christian village in Serbia, which Sharia does not exist to micromanage. So the Ottomans had Kanun, dynastic law, issued by the Sultan. And for 2 centuries the relationship between Kanun and Sharia had been left deliberately vague, because clarifying it risked someone deciding the Sultan had no right to legislate at all. Suleiman and his chief jurist, Ebu Suud Effendi, solved it by construction. Ebu Suud built the legal architecture that made Kanun and Sharia into one coherent system, in which the Sultan's law is legitimate precisely because it operates in the space Sharia leaves to the ruler, and the whole thing was signed off by the religious establishment. That is what let a Muslim empire run a legal system for a majority Christian European territory for 400 years without either the jurists or the Christians walking out. It is why an Orthodox peasant in Bulgaria could take a case to an Ottoman court and sometimes win, and the records show that they did. The empire's actual superpower was never the janissaries, it was the paperwork. And the next chapter of this video is going to take the paperwork apart and show you the machine, because it is the strangest system of government in the last 1,000 years, and almost nobody in the West has heard of it. But first, the rot, and it starts inside the Golden Age itself, in the Sultan's own household. Her name in the Ottoman record is Hurrem Sultan. Europe called her Roxelana. She arrived at the palace as a slave, taken in a raid in what is now Ukraine, and she was, by every account, nobody. She broke every rule in the institution, and none of them ever came back. Rule 1. Sultans did not marry. They had not married for generations, deliberately, because a legal wife means a father-in-law, and a father-in-law means a faction, and the whole logic of the Ottoman household was that the Sultan should have no in-laws with a claim on him. The mothers of princes were slaves precisely because a slave has no family. Suleiman married her, legally, with a ceremony. Rule 2. A prince's mother went with her son when he was sent to govern a province, and stayed there, and her entire career was her son. One mother, one son, one province, forever. Hürrem stayed in Istanbul, and she moved the harem into the Topkapı Palace, into the Sultan's own residence, where it had never been. Rule 3. Sultans did not have favorites, structurally. Hürrem bore Suleiman multiple sons, and he had no other consorts of note after her. Now, the standard telling makes her a schemer and blames what comes next on her ambition, and that telling started with Venetian ambassadors who found the whole thing scandalous and wrote it up for readers who wanted it to be scandalous. Take the moralizing out and look at the structure, because the structure is the point. The Ottoman succession had no rule. There was no primogeniture. Every son was equally legitimate, and the throne went to whoever took it, and then he killed the others. That system, brutal as it was, had one virtue: it selected. The prince who could build a coalition, run a province, win the army, and move fast was the prince who got the throne, and for 200 years that had produced an unbroken run of frighteningly competent sultans. The moment there is a favorite wife with sons in the capital and the sultan's ear, that selection process stops being a competition between princes in the provinces and starts being a competition inside one household. Which brings us to a tent in 1553 in Anatolia. Mustafa was Suleiman's eldest son by an earlier consort. He was, by every surviving account, including the hostile ones, everything an Ottoman heir was supposed to be. Competent, popular, a capable governor, and loved by the army, genuinely, in a way that made the court nervous, because the Janissaries talked about him the way soldiers talk about a commander they would follow. In 1553, the empire was campaigning in the east, and there were reports and rumors and letters that may have been forged, suggesting that Mustafa was negotiating with the Safavids and that the army wanted him on the throne now. Suleiman summoned him to the imperial tent. Everyone around Mustafa told him not to go. He went, because refusing was itself the crime, and because he seems to have believed his father would not do it. Inside the tent were the mutes, the palace executioners, with a bowstring. They killed him in his father's tent while the army stood outside, and the accounts say the army could hear it. Then the Janissaries came apart. They did not desert. They did something more dangerous. They rioted, in camp, on campaign, against their own sultan over the murder of the man they had wanted. And Suleiman the Magnificent, at the height of his power, with the greatest army on earth, could not simply order them to stop. He had to give them a head. He dismissed and handed over his Grand Vizier, Rustem Pasha, to quiet them, and Rustem was, incidentally, Hürrem's son-in-law. Look at what just happened, because it is the most important event in the second half of this video, and it is not a battle. The army had just discovered that it could veto a succession, not choose one, not yet. But it had killed a Grand Vizier by shouting, and the Sultan had complied, and every Janissary in that camp went home knowing it. In 1622, they will murder a Sultan. In 1807, they will murder another one for trying to build an army that is not them. In 1826, an Ottoman Sultan will finally solve the problem by turning artillery on their barracks and killing them all, and by then, it will be far too late. That is a straight line, and it starts in a tent in 1553, on the day the lawgiver killed the best heir the dynasty ever produced. It got worse. Another son, Bayezid, revolted a few years later. was beaten, fled to Persia, and was handed back by the Shah in exchange for gold and executed with his children, which left Selim, the one the army did not want, the one nobody had chosen, the last man standing in a household that had eaten itself. They would call him Selim the drunkard, and he would never command an army in the field, in a state whose entire theory of legitimacy was that the Sultan commands the army in the field. And Suleiman? Suleiman went back to war, because there was nothing else. In 1565, he sent a fleet and an army to Malta to finish the knights he had let go from Rhodes 43 years earlier. And the knights, dug into a rock with no water, held for 4 months and broke the assault, and the Ottoman fleet went home. He had built that defeat himself, in 1522, with a gesture. In 1566, aged 71, gouty, carried in a litter because he could no longer sit a horse, he went on his 13th campaign to a fortress in Hungary called Szigetvar. He died in his tent during the siege, and his Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha did not tell anyone. Sokolu had the body embalmed and propped up. He forged the Sultan's signature on orders. He had the corpse dressed and seated in the imperial carriage, with the curtains arranged, so that the army could see the shape of their Sultan riding among them. He kept the siege going and took the fortress. He kept the army in the field, and then kept it marching home, for weeks, in the summer, with the Sultan dead in the coach, until the heir could reach the capital and take the throne without a civil war. The soldiers found out when it was over. So hold the image, because it is the truest picture of this empire anyone will ever get. At the absolute peak of the Ottoman Golden Age, the state was being run for weeks by a dead man in a carriage, and it worked. It worked because the machine was so good that the Sultan had become, temporarily, optional. The orders went out, the army obeyed, the fortress fell, the succession held. The next 4 centuries are the story of exactly how long a machine that good can run without anybody driving it. Stop. For the last hour, this has been a story about men. Osman on a frontier, Mehmed at a wall, Suleiman in a tent with a bowstring. That is how this empire is always told, and it is the wrong question, because every dynasty in history has produced a run of talented men. The Ottomans produced 10 in a row, which is remarkable, and then produced 24 mediocrities and lunatics after them, which is normal, and the empire kept running for 300 more years anyway. So the men are not the answer. Here is the real question, and it is the one this whole video exists to answer. How does one family, from one small clan, hold 3 continents, 4 religions, and a dozen languages together for 6 centuries, at a time when every monarchy in Europe is tearing itself to pieces over one religion and one language? Because that is the part that should not be possible. While the Ottomans were running Orthodox Greeks, Catholic Croats, Armenian Christians, Sephardic Jews, Sunni Arabs, Shia Iraqis, Alevi Turkmen, Kurds, Bosnians, Serbs, and Bulgarians inside a single state, France was murdering its Protestants in the street. Spain was expelling and burning. England was executing people over which language the service was in. Germany was about to lose something in the region of 1/3 of its population in a war about the same question. Europe could not manage 2 kinds of Christian. The Ottomans were running 4 religions and not having a war about it. Not because they were nicer. Nobody in this story is nice. Because they had built a machine for it, and Europe had not. Here is the machine. Start with the part that is hardest to hear. Every few years, Ottoman officials went out into the Christian villages of the Balkans with a register and a quota, and took the boys. It was called the devshirme, the collection. Roughly 1 household in 40, at irregular intervals. boys generally between about 8 and 18, selected by officials who were looking for health, intelligence, and physical promise. The village priest produced the baptismal records. The boys were registered by name, by father, by village, and marched to Istanbul. They were converted to Islam. They were circumcised. They were taught Turkish. Their families, in most cases, never saw them again. And then they were educated, and this is where the story stops going the way you expect. The ones judged the most promising went to the palace school, inside Topkapı, and got an education that was, in the 15th and 16th centuries, arguably the best available anywhere on earth. Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, Islamic law, mathematics, calligraphy, administration, horsemanship, archery, and a craft, because every one of them, including the ones who would end up running provinces, had to learn to make something with his hands. The rest went to the Janissary Corps. Now here is the fact that should reorganize your understanding of this empire. These men were slaves, not metaphorically. In legal terms, they were the property of the Sultan. They could be executed at his word without trial, and their possessions reverted to him on death. And they ran everything: the grand viziers, the provincial governors, the admirals, the treasurers, the chief architect, who built the mosques you see in every photograph of Istanbul. For roughly 2 centuries, the most powerful men in the Ottoman Empire, the men who commanded its armies and wrote its policy and negotiated its treaties, were almost all legally the Sultan's property, and almost all of them had been born Christian in a village in the Balkans. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha was taken as a boy from a village in Bosnia. He is the man from the end of the last chapter, the one who propped up Suleiman's corpse in a carriage and kept an empire running with it. He was Grand Vizier for 14 years, under 3 sultans, and for most of that period he was, in effect, the government. He built the bridge at Visegrad that is still standing, and when he had the power, he used some of it to have the Serbian Orthodox Patriarchate restored, and installed a member of his own family, a relative he had left behind as a Christian, at the head of it. The most powerful Muslim in the empire, born a Christian peasant, reaching back to his village to rebuild the church he had been taken out of. That is the Devshirme. And here is where this video is going to refuse to make it simple, because both of the things you are about to hear are true and documented, and any telling that gives you only one of them is lying to you. It was a child levy. Families hid their sons in the hills when the officials came. They married boys off early because married boys were exempt. Some families mutilated their own children to make them ineligible. There are Balkan folk songs about the collection that are lamentations, and they are not subtle, and they survived for centuries because the wound did. And families bribed officials to get their sons in. That is also documented, and it becomes more common over time, and there is a specific reason. Muslim families were not eligible, and Muslim families wanted in, and they lobbied for exemptions to be broken so their sons could enter. Because for a boy in a mud village in Bosnia, in 1550, the Devshirme was the only ladder in the world that went from nothing to Grand Vizier of the largest empire on earth. And it was not a metaphorical ladder. Men actually climbed it. Everyone in that village knew a name, both things. A community grieving and a queue forming. Hold them at the same time, because the empire did. Now, why? Why build the state like this at all? Because of the problem that destroyed every monarchy in Europe. A European king's problem was his nobles. They had land, they had it by blood, they kept it by blood, they raised their own men, and they were permanent. A king could not fire a duke. He could not appoint a talented peasant over a duke's head. Every European monarch spent his reign negotiating with a hereditary class that had its own armies and did not need him. And half the wars in European history are a king trying to make his own nobility do what he says. The Ottomans looked at that problem and solved it by not having a nobility. An elite recruited from outside the empire's Muslim population, converted, raised in the palace, with no clan, no tribe, no ancestral land, no faction, no family name that meant anything, and no possible claim to anything except the Sultan's favor, is an elite that cannot form a hereditary aristocracy, cannot inherit a power base, and cannot pass anything to a son. The Sultan's slaves are the safest servants in the world because they have nowhere else to be. It is one of the most ruthless and effective pieces of institutional design in the history of government. And it works perfectly, for exactly as long as one condition holds. They cannot inherit. Remember that. It is going to be the first thing that breaks. Now the second pillar, and the one that explains both the peace and, eventually, the fire. The millet system. The Ottomans did not organize their subjects by geography. They organized them by faith. The Orthodox millet, the Armenian millet, the Jewish millet, later others. Each one was a legally recognized community, headed by its own religious leader, who was appointed by and answerable to the Sultan. And each one ran its own affairs, its own courts, for its own people, in its own law, its own schools, in its own language. Marriage, divorce, inheritance, property between its own members, all handled internally. Its own tax collection, delivered to the state as a lump. An Orthodox Greek in Ottoman Salonika in 1600 was born, educated, married, judged, and buried under Orthodox authority, in Greek, by Greeks. The Ottoman state's involvement in his life was that his community paid tax and did not raise an army. That was the deal, and it was explicit. Pay the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims. Accept a defined and real second-class legal status, which included things like restrictions on new church construction, disadvantages in court against a Muslim, and rules about dress and public display that were sometimes enforced and sometimes ignored. Do not carry arms. Do not proselytize. And in exchange, keep everything. Your God, your language, your law, your school, your priest, your community, intact, unmolested, for as long as the empire stands. Do not call this tolerance in the modern sense. It was not. Nobody was equal, and nobody pretended to be. But do not call it simple oppression either, because that fails to explain the single most inconvenient fact in the entire period, which is that Jews expelled from Spain got on Ottoman ships, and Orthodox Christians in the last days of Constantinople said out loud that they would rather have the Sultan's turban than the Pope's hat. And Protestants in Hungary in the 17th century sometimes preferred Ottoman rule to Habsburg rule, and said so in print, because the Ottomans did not care which kind of Christian they were, and the Habsburgs cared very much. Call it what it was, a functioning system of managed inequality, which is worse than equality, and which was, measured against the actual alternatives available in Europe in 1550, extraordinarily attractive, and which is why it held for 400 years without a religious war, and it contains a bomb. Because look at what the millet system does over 4 centuries. It takes every community in the empire, and it teaches it, institutionally, generation after generation, that it is a distinct people with its own law, its own language, its own schools, its own leadership, and its own permanent identity. The Ottomans did not assimilate anyone. That was the genius. They ran an empire without ever demanding that anyone become Ottoman. In the age of empires, that is the reason they lasted. Then, in the 19th century, a new idea arrives from France. And the idea is that a people with its own language and its own church and its own identity is a nation, and that every nation should have a state. And the Ottoman Empire discovers that it has spent 400 years pre-assembling the parts. Every millet was already a nation in waiting. It had the language, the leadership, the institutions, the schools, and a completely intact sense of itself, because the empire had protected all of it, deliberately, at state expense, as policy. The system that made the empire ungovernable to destroy from outside, made it perfectly designed to come apart from inside. The moment the century changed, hold that. It is the whole back half of this video. Third pillar, quickly, because it is the same idea, again in another suit. Land. In Europe, a lord owned his land, forever, and passed it to his son. In the classical Ottoman system, nobody owned anything. Land belonged to the state. What the state handed out was timar, the right to collect the revenue of a district, given to a cavalryman, a sipahi, in exchange for showing up when called with horses, armor, and a specified number of armed men. It was not property. It was not hereditary in principle. It could be revoked. When the sipahi died, it went back to the state and got reassigned. So no Ottoman cavalryman could accumulate an estate, build a dynasty on it, and become a duke. There was no aristocracy in the countryside. For the same reason, there was none at court. The Ottomans had looked at the European disease and vaccinated against it twice. And the fourth pillar you already know, the Janissaries, the first standing professional infantry in Europe, salaried in cash, housed in barracks, drilled in peacetime, forbidden to marry in the early period, and forbidden to trade, so that they had nothing in their lives but the corpse. Equipped with firearms early, and drilled with them hard, at a time when European knights still thought guns were for peasants. Now, put the four together and look at what you have: an elite that cannot inherit, a landholding class that cannot inherit, an army with no families and no other trade, and a subject population organized into self-running communities that pay and stay quiet. There is no hereditary power anywhere in the entire structure. Every single ladder in the empire runs directly to the Sultan and terminates there. That is why one family held it for 600 years. And it is why in 1550 the Ottoman state could do things in a season that took European monarchies a decade of negotiating with their own dukes. And now watch every single one of those advantages invert. The Janissaries were forbidden to marry, so they had no sons. Then they were allowed to marry. Then their sons were allowed to enroll. Then enrollment was open to Muslims generally, and the devshirme wound down and died out in the 17th century. Then the corps figured out that a Janissary payroll ticket was a financial asset. It paid a salary, so the tickets were traded, bought and sold, inherited, held by men who had never seen a barracks, and by widows, and by children. And the Janissaries, forbidden to trade, became tradesmen. They ran shops in Istanbul. They ran the markets. They became a guild. So by 1700, the elite corps that had been designed, deliberately, precisely, to have no families, no property, no trade, and no interests outside the Sultan's service, had become a hereditary caste of shopkeepers with an armed lobby, a payroll they could not be removed from, and an absolute veto on anything that threatened it. Which is to say, they had become exactly the thing the entire Ottoman system was built to prevent. They had become the nobility. The Timars went the same way. Sipahis stopped being able to afford the kit. The state started needing cash more than cavalry, and the districts got farmed out to tax farmers, iltizam, who bid for the right to collect and kept the difference. And then the tax farms became lifetime grants, and then they became hereditary in fact, and then, by the 18th century, a class of provincial magnates existed with land, money, and private armies. The Ayan, hereditary local lords. The Ottoman Empire, after 400 years of successfully preventing an aristocracy from forming, grew one anyway, from the tax system, in about a century, and the palace, fratricide, was the succession rule. This video has already argued why, and the argument was cold, and it was correct. But it depended on grown princes, governing provinces, competing, building coalitions, and one of them winning. A brutal selection process that reliably produced men who could rule. In the 17th century, they stopped doing it. Partly revulsion, partly the demographic terror of a dynasty that had come close to running out of men. What replaced it was the cafes, the cage. Spare princes were no longer killed. They were kept in an apartment inside the palace, for life, or until the throne came to them. Not tortured, housed, fed, with servants whose tongues were sometimes cut so they could not carry messages. For years, for decades. And then, when the Sultan died, the state would go to the apartment, open the door, and put the man inside on the throne of the largest empire in Europe. He had never governed a province. He had never commanded a regiment. He had never negotiated a treaty, ridden with an army, or, in some cases, held a conversation with an adult who was not a servant, since he was a child. The Ottomans had stopped murdering princes and started producing sultans who were structurally incapable of ruling. And that vacuum got filled, because a vacuum at the top of a machine, that good will always get filled. It got filled by the Grand Viziers, by the Janissary command, and above all by the one person in the palace, with permanent standing, permanent access, and a permanent interest in the survival of that specific sultan, his mother, the Valide Sultan, head of the imperial household, controller of access, manager of an enormous budget and an enormous patronage network, and, when the Sultan was a child or a recluse, the effective government of the empire. Later writers called this period the Sultanate of Women, and they meant it as a diagnosis, as the thing that went wrong. This video is going to deal with that phrase properly in a moment, and it is going to deal with it unkindly. But first, close the chapter, because everything from here to the grave is contained in this one idea. Every institution described in this chapter was brilliant, and every institution described in this chapter was designed precisely and exclusively for a world of frontiers, horses, expansion, and conquest. The Devshirme needed conquered Christian villages. The Timur needed new land to hand out. The Janissary Corps needed a war every year. The whole machine was a conquest engine, and every part of it was calibrated for permanent growth. In 1529, at the walls of Vienna, in the rain, the empire found out that the growth had a radius. And it could not retool, not because Ottomans were incapable of thinking. They thought about it constantly, and wrote about it, and there is an entire genre of Ottoman political literature from the 17th century that is nothing but men diagnosing the decline in enormous detail. It could not retool because the institutions were sacred, because they were interlocking, and because by then every one of them was staffed by people who would kill anybody who tried. The Ottoman Empire did not decline because it got weak. It declined because it got stuck. And the world kept moving. Selim II took the throne in 1566 and never commanded an army in the field. Hold that against everything you have just heard. The entire theory of Ottoman legitimacy was that the Sultan is the Ghazi, the warrior, the man at the front of the army. It is in the titles. It is on the coins. It is the reason the state exists. Suleiman died at 71, on his 13th campaign, because a sultan who does not campaign is not, in a meaningful sense, a sultan. His son sat in the palace. The empire did not notice for a while, because Sokolu Mehmed Pasha was still there, and Sokolu ran it superbly. And this is the first appearance of the pattern that defines the next 2 centuries. The machine covering for the man. In 1570, the empire took Cyprus off Venice. It was a real strategic prize, a large, rich, defensible island sitting directly on the route between Istanbul and Egypt was now the empire's grain basket and its treasury. Europe responded with a holy league. The Pope, Spain, Venice, Genoa, Malta, and Savoy, which was a coalition that Europe had failed to assemble for a century. In October 1571, off the coast of Greece, at Lepanto, that fleet met the Ottoman fleet and destroyed it. It was the largest naval battle in the Mediterranean in over 1,000 years, and it was total. The Ottoman fleet was annihilated. The Christian galley slaves were freed by the thousand. Miguel de Cervantes was there and took a shot that crippled his left hand for life, and he described it for the rest of his life as the greatest occasion the past or present had seen. Europe went insane with joy. Bells rang in every capital. The Pope declared a feast day that is still in the Catholic calendar. Paintings were commissioned for 200 years. Lepanto entered the Western memory as the day the tide turned, the moment the Turk was stopped, the hinge of the age. Now the actual outcome. Within about a year, the Ottomans had rebuilt the fleet, not a token force. A fleet of comparable size, built from scratch in the imperial arsenals over a single winter, because the Ottoman state had the timber, the money, the shipyards, and the administrative capacity to simply order it, and Venice did not have the capacity to do it again. The Holy League fell apart almost immediately, because Venice wanted Cyprus back, and Spain wanted North Africa, and the Pope wanted a crusade, and they had only ever agreed on one afternoon. Venice made peace in 1573 and formally ceded Cyprus. The Ottomans kept Cyprus. They kept it for 307 years. There is a line attributed to Sokolu, delivered to the Venetian envoy, to the effect that the Christians had singed the Sultan's beard, which grows back, while the Ottomans had cut off Venice's arm, which does not. The sourcing is not solid enough to quote as a transcript, so treat it as the Ottoman court's own summary of the outcome, rather than as a recording. But the summary is correct. Lepanto was a real, catastrophic, spectacular defeat that changed almost nothing on the map. Europe won the battle and lost the island, and then spent 400 years telling the story about the battle. So why does everyone know Lepanto? Because Europe needed one. Because for 200 years, since Nicopolis in 1396, the West had not had a single day it could point to and say, "We stopped them." The tide was not turning in 1571. Europe simply could not go one more generation without a story in which it did. Watch for this pattern for the rest of the video, because it recurs. The turning points in the Western telling of Ottoman history are mostly retroactive. They are the days Europe decided, afterward, to feel better about. The days that actually mattered are treaties and account books and men in rooms. Now, the 17th century and the phrase. Selim II died in 1574, reportedly after slipping in a bathhouse. Murad III reigned for 2 decades and left the palace approximately never. Mehmed III took the throne in 1595 and, on his accession, had 19 of his brothers executed, which is the last mass application of the fratricide law, and which horrified even Istanbul, and after that the cage replaces the bowstring. What follows is a century of child sultans, recluse sultans, and men taken out of a locked apartment, and handed an empire. And so power went where power goes, to the household, to the grand viziers, to the Janissary command, and to the Valid sultans, who were, for stretches of the 17th century, the actual government of the Ottoman Empire. Kösem Sultan is the most formidable of them. She was, at various times, the power behind her husband, then regent for one son, then regent for another son, then regent for her grandson, and she ran the empire in some form across roughly 3 decades and multiple reigns. She was, by every account, extremely good at it, and she was strangled in the palace in 1651 in a factional coup organized, in effect, by her own daughter-in-law who wanted the job. Later Ottoman writers named this era the Sultanate of Women, and they meant it as an autopsy. This is what went wrong. The women got in. Look at what actually happened in that period, though. The empire took Crete in a siege of 21 years, which is one of the longest sieges in recorded history, off Venice, which was a first-rank naval power. It fought Persia to a standstill and took Baghdad back. Its borders in Europe did not move backward. And at the end of the century, it put an army at the gates of Vienna, again. That is not the record of a state being ruined by its harem. The Sultanate of Women is a story told by men who lost Vienna, about why it was not their fault. The failure was structural, and this video already explained it 1 chapter ago. The cage produced sultans who could not rule. Somebody had to. The women in the palace were the only people in the building with permanent standing, permanent access, and no ability to be sent to a province. They did not seize the government. The government fell on them because the men who designed the system had removed every other option. Blaming them is the oldest move in politics. It is not analysis. It is an alibi. Here is what was actually going wrong, and it is in the barracks. In 1622, a young sultan named Osman II, aged 17, came back from a failed campaign against Poland, having reached a conclusion that was completely correct. The Janissaries were no longer an army. They were a guild with weapons. They had fought badly. They had refused to obey, and the corps was full of men who had bought their tickets. He announced that he was going on pilgrimage to Mecca. It was widely understood, correctly, that he was actually going to Anatolia and Syria to raise a new army from the Turkish and Arab provinces, a real one, and come back and destroy the corps. The Janissaries revolted, dragged him from the palace, took him to the fortress of Yedikule, and killed him. The first regicide in the history of the House of Osman. 323 years, 30-odd sultans, and the first one murdered by his own subjects was murdered by his own army, and the reason was that he had tried to reform it. Draw the line from the tent in 1553. Suleiman kills Mustafa. The Janissaries riot. The Sultan gives them a grand vizier's head to calm them down. In that moment, the corps learns that shouting works. 69 years later, they know that killing works too, and it will work again. In 1807, they will depose and murder another sultan for exactly the same offense, building an army that is not them, and there will be 185 years between the first regicide and the day the Ottoman state finally solves the problem with artillery. And in every one of those years, the empire's most dangerous enemy was its own infantry. There is one exception in this century, and he is worth 90 seconds. Murad IV took the throne as a child and grew into something the 17th century did not otherwise produce. He was enormous, physically formidable, and completely without restraint. He banned tobacco, coffee, and alcohol, and he enforced the bans personally, walking the streets of Istanbul at night in disguise and executing people he caught, on the spot, by his own hand. The death toll of his reign inside the capital runs into the thousands. He also broke the Janissaries' grip temporarily by terrifying them, retook Baghdad from the Safavids in 1638, and restored the treasury. And he died in 1640, aged 27, of cirrhosis of the liver, while enforcing his ban on alcohol. Move on, the contradiction is the whole point, and it does not need a paragraph. By 1656, the empire was in genuine crisis. Venice had blockaded the Dardanelles and was sitting on Istanbul's throat. The treasury was empty. The Janissaries had rioted again and hanged officials in the hippodrome. The child sultan's mother, in desperation, offered near absolute power to an 80-year-old Albanian named Koprulu Mehmed Pasha. He accepted, on written conditions, that no order of his would be countermanded, that no complaint against him would be heard, that he would appoint whom he liked, that nobody at court would interfere. They agreed, and it worked, brutally. He executed his way through the corrupt administration, broke the blockade, and stabilized the state. His son succeeded him, and then a relative, and the Köprülü viziers ran the Ottoman Empire for most of half a century, and under them it recovered hard. Crete finally fell in 1669, after a siege that had lasted 21 years. The armies were back in the field and winning, which is the necessary setup, because the revival was real, and it is what makes the next fact land. In 1683, the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha marched on Vienna with one of the largest armies the empire had ever assembled. He had a genuine plan and a genuine opportunity. Hungary was in revolt against the Habsburgs, and the rebels had invited him in. The Habsburgs were distracted. France, under Louis XIV, was hostile to Vienna and quietly delighted. He got there in July and besieged it for 2 months. His engineers mined under the walls. The garrison was down to a few thousand effectives. The city was days from falling, and the sources on both sides agree about that. And then the relief army came over the hills. Polish, Austrian, German, Saxon, assembled by a papal envoy who had spent a year begging, and led by John III Sobieski, King of Poland. On the 12th of September, they came down off the Kahlenberg into the Ottoman flank, in what is remembered as one of the largest cavalry charges ever delivered, and the Ottoman army broke. Kara Mustafa got out with a fraction of his force. He was strangled in Belgrade on the Sultan's order, and his head was sent to Istanbul in a bag. And now the part that matters, which is not the battle. Every previous Ottoman defeat had been an interruption. Ankara in 1402, and the empire came back stronger. Lepanto in 1571, and the fleet was rebuilt by spring. Malta in 1565, and nothing changed. For 384 years, the Ottoman Empire had absorbed defeats, the way a large animal absorbs a wound. This time, the wound did not close. The Holy League that formed after Vienna did not fall apart the way the one after Lepanto did. Austria, Poland, Venice, and, for the first time, Russia stayed in the field, and they kept coming for 16 years. And in 1699, at Karlowitz, the Ottoman Empire signed a treaty. Read what that treaty is, because it is the pivot of 6 centuries, and it is a document, not a battlefield. The Ottomans gave away Hungary and Transylvania to Austria, the Morea to Venice, Podolia to Poland, Azov to Russia, permanently, in writing, in exchange for nothing. It is the first time in the history of the Ottoman Empire that the state formally, legally, permanently ceded territory and received nothing back. Every treaty before this had been a pause between campaigns. This one was a subtraction, and both sides understood it. And the Ottoman negotiators understood it best of all, because they were the ones who had to sit at a table in Habsburg territory as the party that had lost and negotiate about how much. From 1299 to 1699, 400 years, the map only grows. From 1699 to 1922, 223 years, the map only shrinks. There is no other line in Ottoman history that clean. So the empire now knows something it has never had to know in 4 centuries. It can lose, not a battle. It can lose permanently, and it can be made to sign. The next 200 years are one long, increasingly desperate argument about what to do about that. And every single answer will be worse than the last. Here is the trap the Ottoman Empire walks into after 1699, and it never gets out of it. And it is the reason there is no version of this story with a happy ending. Everything that has to be fixed is load-bearing. The Janissaries have to be reformed, and the Janissaries are the only army there is. The tax system has to be rebuilt, and the tax farmers are now the provincial elite who deliver the revenue. The whole conquest machine has to be retooled for a world with borders, and every institution in the state exists because of conquest, and every man in those institutions knows it. Every reform requires destroying something that is currently holding the roof up. And so the 18th and 19th centuries are a sequence of Ottoman statesmen, most of them intelligent, several of them brilliant, all of them correct about the diagnosis, discovering in turn that the operation kills the patient and that not operating also kills the patient. Start with the gardens. After Karlowitz, the empire did something it had not done in 400 years. It stopped. The period from 1718 to 1730 is called the Tulip Era, the Lale Devri, and it is the empire's first taste of a thing it had never had, which is peace, as a policy rather than as a gap. The court built pleasure palaces along the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus. It commissioned poetry. It sent an ambassador to Paris with instructions to study everything and report, and he did, and the report was read. Ibrahim Müteferrika, a Hungarian convert, got permission and opened a printing press for books in Turkish in 1727, which is roughly 270 years after Gutenberg, and this fact gets misquoted constantly, so be precise about it. Jewish printers had been operating presses in Istanbul since the 1490s, and Armenians and Greeks had them too. What was new in 1727 was printing in Turkish, in Arabic script, which had been resisted by the scribal guilds whose livelihood it destroyed, and by religious authorities uneasy about the mechanical reproduction of a script that carried the Quran. And they became obsessed with tulips. The flower had gone from Ottoman gardens to Vienna in the 1550s, to Leiden in the 1590s, and had produced the first speculative bubble in recorded history in Holland in 1637. Now, 90 years later, the Ottoman elite imported it back from the Dutch, in cultivated varieties the Dutch had bred, and paid insane prices for bulbs, and held tulip festivals in the palace gardens, with candles tied to the backs of tortoises to move light through the flower beds at night. That image is the tulip era. It is also the problem, because outside the gardens, the provinces were being squeezed by tax farmers to pay for the gardens. A war with Persia was going badly, and the price of bread in Istanbul was a political fact. In 1730, an Albanian ex-janissary and part-time bath attendant named Patrona Halil led a revolt out of the Istanbul markets. The Grand Vizier was killed and his body dragged through the streets. Sultan Ahmed III was deposed. The palaces along the Bosphorus were burned. The tulip beds were destroyed, deliberately, as the target. And here is the pattern that has just been established, and it will kill every reform movement for the next 200 years. The reformers are also the spenders, the people looking outward at Europe, reading French books, and building the first press, are the same people building the pleasure palaces and paying for tulips. So from the street, reform and corruption are indistinguishable. Westernization looks exactly like the elite enriching itself and abandoning the faith, because the same men are doing both at the same time in the same buildings. Every Ottoman reformer from here to 1908 will be killed with that argument, and the argument will not always be wrong. Meanwhile, a new enemy has appeared, and it is not like the old ones. Russia is not a crusade. It is a state, with a professional army, a fleet, a bureaucracy, an expanding population, and a permanent strategic objective that does not change with the monarch. Russia wants the Black Sea and then the Straits, forever, and Russia is prepared to fight for it every 20 years for 2 centuries, and it does. The Russo-Turkish wars of the 18th century go badly in a new way. Not a defeat and a treaty and a pause. A grinding, systematic pressure from a state that is modernizing faster than the Ottomans are. In 1774, the empire signed Küçük Kaynarca, and it is the worst treaty in Ottoman history to that point. Worse than Karlowitz, and for reasons that are not territorial. The Crimean Khanate was detached from Ottoman suzerainty and declared independent, which meant, as everyone in the room understood, that Russia would annex it, and Russia did, 9 years later. That was the first time the Ottoman Empire lost a Muslim territory, not a Christian province in the Balkans, taken in the first place. Muslim land, Tatar land, a Khanate that had been Ottoman aligned since Mehmed the Conqueror. And the treaty contained a clause, vague, deliberately or carelessly, that gave Russia a right to make representations on behalf of a church in Istanbul, and which Russia proceeded to interpret, for the next century and a half, as a protectorate over every Orthodox Christian subject of the Sultan. Look at what just happened. The Ottomans built the millet system to run other people's religions cheaply. They put the Orthodox Church on the state payroll in 1454 as an instrument of Ottoman control. And a foreign empire has just turned that instrument into a legal claim on the internal affairs of the Ottoman state. Every Orthodox subject of the Sultan is now, in the Russian reading, a Russian interest. Every grievance is now a diplomatic incident. Every riot is now a potential casus belli. The machine has been turned around and aimed backward, and it will be pointed at the empire's chest, repeatedly, until 1918, which brings us to a sultan who understood every part of this and had a plan. Selim III took the throne in 1789, the year the Bastille fell, which is a coincidence that turns out to be relevant. His program was called the Nizam-ı-Jadid, the New Order, and it was exactly right. A new army, recruited fresh, trained on European lines by French officers, in European uniforms, with modern drill, modern artillery, and modern engineering, new military schools, a new treasury to fund it, with new taxes, kept deliberately separate from the old one, so the old interests could not strangle it. Permanent embassies in European capitals, which the Ottomans had never had, because for 4 centuries they had not needed to know what Europe thought. And it worked. The New Order troops were good. They fought well. They were visibly, embarrassingly better than the Janissaries. That is why it failed, because the Janissaries were not looking at a military reform. They were looking at a competent army that was not them, funded by a treasury they did not control, which would, obviously, one day be used to abolish them, because that is exactly what Osman II had tried in 1622, and it is exactly what Mahmud II would do in 1826. In 1807 they revolted, allied with the religious conservatives who hated the French uniforms and the ulema who hated the new taxes, and they deposed Selim III, and the following year When a relief force marched on the palace to restore him, they murdered him first, so there would be nothing to restore. Say the sentence plainly, because it is the thesis of this act. For 185 years, the Ottoman Empire's most dangerous enemy was its own army, and the thing that army was defending was its right not to have to fight well. And now the idea arrives. In 1821, the Greeks revolted. This was not a peasant rising over taxes. There had been dozens of those, and the empire crushed them without difficulty. This was something the Ottoman state had no equipment to understand, because it had never existed before. It was nationalism. The idea came out of the French Revolution, and it traveled through the Greek merchant communities of Odessa and Vienna and Marseille. And it said something the Ottomans had spent 400 years making structurally plausible. We are a people. We have our own language, and our own church, and our own schools, and our own law, and our own history. We are a nation, and every nation is entitled to a state. Read that against the millet system, and it is a key, going into a lock. The Ottomans machined themselves. The empire had protected Greek language, Greek education, Greek clergy, and Greek communal identity for 4 centuries, at state expense, as deliberate policy, because it was cheaper than assimilating them. It had produced, by 1821, a population that had been institutionally trained for 400 years to think of itself as a distinct nation, and had never been asked to think of itself as Ottoman. The Ottomans did not fail to assimilate the Greeks. They never tried. That was the design. And when the century turned, the design detonated. The war was atrocious on both sides, and this video is not going to pretend otherwise. Massacres of Muslim civilians in the Morea at the outset, tens of thousands. Essentially, the extermination of the Muslim population of southern Greece. Ottoman reprisals, the hanging of the Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul on Easter Sunday, which was a catastrophic decision that horrified Europe, and the massacre and enslavement of the population of Chios, which Delacroix painted, and which turned European opinion permanently. And then the fact that reveals the whole state of the empire. The Ottomans could not win it. They had to call in Muhammad Ali of Egypt, their own vassal, an Albanian officer who had taken Egypt for himself and then done, successfully, in one province, the exact reform program that had gotten Selim III murdered in the capital. He had a conscript army, trained by French officers, with modern artillery and a modern navy, and factories and cotton exports to pay for it. Muhammad Ali's son took his modern Egyptian army into Greece and very nearly finished the revolt. And then Britain, France, and Russia, whose publics had been fed Byron and Delacroix for 6 years, sent a combined fleet to Navarino in 1827 and destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian navy in an afternoon, in a battle nobody had officially declared and which the British commander was later censured for. Greece became independent in 1832. The first millet had become a nation. Serbia was already effectively autonomous. Everybody in the Balkans was watching, which is when Mahmud II, having watched his cousin Selim murdered, having spent 17 years being extremely careful and building support quietly, finally did the thing. In June 1826, he announced the formation of new European-style units. The Janissaries did exactly what they had done in 1622 and 1807. They overturned their soup kettles in the barracks, which was the traditional signal of mutiny, and they came out into the hippodrome to depose another sultan. Mahmud had spent 17 years preparing for that afternoon. The artillery was already sighted. The gunners were loyal, and they were not Janissaries. The ulema had been squared in advance and declared the corps in rebellion against the faith. He turned the guns on the barracks and fired grape shot into them for hours, and then burned what was left. Thousands died in a day. The corps was abolished by decree, the name erased from the registers, the associated Bektashi Sufi order suppressed and its lodges closed. Survivors were hunted through the provinces for months. The Ottomans call it the auspicious incident. And here is the double edge, and it is the payoff of this entire act. Mahmud II had just removed the single greatest obstacle to reform in the Ottoman Empire. 400 years of institutional veto, gone in an afternoon. Everything that follows, every school, every railway, every code of law, is possible because of that day. He had also just destroyed his own army, in the middle of a war, and he had nothing to replace it with yet. And so, 10 years later, when Muhammad Ali of Egypt decided that the empire was finished and marched his modern army north through Syria and into Anatolia and headed for Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire had no way to stop its own governor. Mahmud II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Caliph, had to ask Russia for help. Russia, the empire that had taken Crimea, that had a legal claim over his Christian subjects, that had wanted the Straits for a century. And Russian troops landed on the Bosphorus, at the Sultan's invitation, to save the Ottoman Empire from Egypt. The empire was rescued from its own vassal by the enemy that wanted it dead, and had to pay for the rescue with a treaty giving Russia rights in the Straits. Mahmud II died in 1839, still at war with his own Egyptian governor, having spent his entire reign amputating his own state to save it. He had destroyed the Janissaries, he had broken the Ayan, he had centralized the bureaucracy, opened schools, built a postal system, and put the empire on the road to being a modern state. And he had lost Greece, effectively lost Serbia, lost Algeria to the French in 1830, lost Egypt in all but name, and every year the empire got smaller. His son inherited a modern state, a modern bureaucracy, no janissaries, no army worth the name, and no money. And the money is what is going to finish it. In January 1853, in a private conversation in St. Petersburg, the Tsar of Russia said something to the British ambassador about a neighbor of his. Nicholas I described the Ottoman Empire as a sick man. A very sick man, a man who had fallen into decrepitude. He said it was a great misfortune to have such a man on one's hands, and he suggested, without much delicacy, that arrangements should be made before he died on the carpet. The exact wording is not certain. It comes to us through the ambassador's report, and historians have argued about the phrasing for a century, and the phrase, the sick man of Europe, in the form everyone knows, is a compression that happened afterward. The meaning was not ambiguous. The Tsar was proposing that Britain and Russia agree, in advance, on how to divide a country that had not died yet, while its ambassador was working 2 streets away. This is the Eastern question. And it is not, as it is usually described, the question of whether the Ottoman Empire will collapse. Everyone in every European foreign ministry had answered that in the affirmative. The Eastern question is a logistics problem. How do you divide the estate of a state the size of the Ottoman Empire without the heirs going to war with each other? That is what kept the empire alive for another 70 years. Not its strength, the inability of the vultures to agree on the carving. It is the same mechanism that saved it during the interregnum in 1402. And the Ottomans knew it, and they played it with enormous skill. And it is why the empire's greatest weapon in the 19th century was not an army. It was an embassy. The Ottoman answer to the Tsar came from Fuad Pasha, one of the great Grand Viziers of the century, and it was the correct answer, and it destroyed them. He agreed. The empire was the sick man of Europe, and there was a cure for the sickness, and the cure was money. Hold that, 60 seconds. First, the reform. Because the last great attempt to save the Ottoman Empire from the inside begins in 1839, and it is called the Tanzimat, the reordering. and it is one of the most ambitious liberal reform programs of the 19th century anywhere in the world. The Edict of 1839 and the Edict of 1856 promised, in the Sultan's own name, the following: security of life, honor and property for every subject, regardless of religion. A regular, assessed system of taxation to replace tax farming. Regular conscription with fixed terms instead of arbitrary levies. Public trials. And, most explosively, equality before the law for Muslims and non-Muslims. The abolition of the jizya and the opening of the army and the civil service to Christians. Secular courts. A commercial code copied from the French. A penal code. State schools. A census. A modern ministry structure. A bank. On paper, it is astonishing. On paper, it turns a medieval Islamic empire into a modern constitutional state in 20 years. And it dissolved the only thing holding the empire together. Because look at the deal the millet system actually was, from both sides. For a Muslim, the arrangement was that you were the community of the ruling faith. You had a real, tangible, daily status advantage, and in exchange you paid the higher price, which was conscription, which was decades of your sons' lives, and frequently their deaths. Nobody conscripted Christians. That was the trade. Tanzimat took the status away and left the conscription. For a Christian community, the arrangement was that you accepted second-class legal status in exchange for total internal autonomy. Your church ran your courts, your schools, your marriages, your money, your identity. Your patriarch was a prince. Tanzimat offered equality in a state, which sounds like a gift, and which in practice meant the state was now going to run the courts and the schools and the conscription. It was the dissolution of the autonomy, in exchange for a promise of equality that a Christian in an Anatolian village in 1860 could see perfectly well was not being delivered in the village. So the Muslim population experienced Tanzimat as a humiliation and a loss of standing imposed by foreigners, because the edicts were written under intense European diplomatic pressure, and everyone knew it. And the Christian communities experienced it as a broken contract and concluded, correctly, that they were now being offered a worse deal, and stopped wanting reform inside the empire and started wanting out of it. Everyone was angrier after the reform than before it. Here is the lesson, and it is not a nice one, and it is why this is not a story about how the Ottomans should have just liberalized sooner. A system built on managed difference cannot be converted into a system built on sameness without destroying the thing that made it work. The Ottoman Empire held 4 religions together for 4 centuries by giving each of them a wall and a door. Tanzimat took the walls down and asked everyone to be citizens instead, and the empire discovered that after 400 years of walls, nobody inside them wanted to be a citizen of anything called Ottoman. They wanted to be Greeks and Serbs and Bulgarians and Armenians, because that is what the empire had spent 4 centuries paying them to be. Now the money. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, was the Eastern question turning into artillery. Russia moved on the pretext of protecting Orthodox Christians, using the clause from Küçük Kaynarca that the Ottomans had handed them in 1774. Britain and France, who could not permit Russia to take the Straits, came in on the Ottoman side, and the Ottomans won, with allies, at enormous cost, against Russia. It is the last time to fight it. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire took its first foreign loan, then another in 1855, then 1858, 1860, 1862, 1863, 1865, and then every single year from 1869 to 1874. The pattern is the one every household in debt recognizes. new loans to service old loans. The terms got worse each time because the risk was visibly rising, and the money went almost entirely to budget deficits and armaments and palaces, and almost none of it to anything that would ever generate revenue to pay it back. Dolmabahce Palace, on the Bosphorus, finished in 1856, is the monument to this. It is enormous. It is European. It has 14 tons of gold on the ceilings and the largest crystal chandelier in the world. And it was built to prove to European ambassadors that this was not a decrepit Oriental despotism, but a modern European court. It reportedly cost something in the region of a quarter of the state's annual tax revenue, and it was paid for with debased coinage, paper money, and foreign loans. The empire went into debt to build a building to convince its creditors it was not the kind of country that would default. On the 30th of October 1875, it defaulted. Here are the numbers, and this video is going to say them slowly, because they are the most important numbers in the last 100 years of Ottoman history, and almost nobody knows them. The total debt at default was something in the region of £214 million. The total annual income of the Ottoman Empire, everything, every tax, every province, every customs house, from Baghdad to Bosnia, was approximately £21.5 million. 10 times everything the empire earned in a year. 6 years later, in 1881, under the decree of Muharrem, the Ottoman Empire agreed to the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. Understand precisely what this was, because it is not a metaphor and it is not an exaggeration. It was a council of European bondholders' representatives, British, French, German, Austrian, Italian, and Ottoman. The presidency alternated between the British and the French delegates, and it was given the direct right to collect specified Ottoman state revenues, itself, with its own staff, inside the Ottoman Empire, and to remit them to European creditors before the Ottoman treasury saw a coin. The salt monopoly, the tobacco monopoly, the stamp tax, the tax on spirits, the fish tax, the silk tithe in certain districts. At its height, the debt administration employed thousands of people across the empire. In some provinces, it had more staff on the ground than the Ottoman finance ministry did. So picture it. A foreign corporation headquartered in Istanbul, staffed by Europeans, collecting Ottoman taxes from Ottoman peasants in Ottoman villages, and sending the money to Paris and London with the Sultan's signature on the arrangement. The Ottoman Empire was not conquered. It was foreclosed on. As the historian Eugene Rogan has put it, the single greatest threat to the independence of the Middle East in that century was not Europe's armies. It was Europe's banks. And Fuad Pasha had been right, and that is the terrible part. The cure was money. They found the money. The money was the cure, and the money was the poison. And there was never a version where they did not take it, because the alternative was to stay obsolete and be partitioned in 1860 instead of 1920. Into this walks the last sultan who mattered. Abdul Hamid II came to the throne in 1876, in a year when the empire had 3 sultans, and he came in on a promise. The reformers who put him there wanted a constitution, and he gave them one. The Ottoman Empire got a written constitution and an elected parliament, with Muslim, Christian, and Jewish deputies sitting together, and it was, in 1876, more liberal than most of Europe. He suspended it in 1878 and ruled without it for 30 years. The reason he gives is not nothing. In 1877, Russia invaded, and it went catastrophically. Russian troops reached San Stefano, a suburb of Istanbul, close enough that the government could see the campfires. The empire lost, comprehensively, and at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, the European powers sat down and carved off most of what remained in Europe. Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro fully independent. Bulgaria, autonomous and enormous. Bosnia handed to Austria to administer. Cyprus handed to Britain to administer, in exchange for a promise. And then the part nobody tells, and it is the single most important omitted fact in the standard history of this empire. The people came with it. When Bulgaria became Bulgarian, the Muslims who had lived there for 500 years did not stay. When the Caucasus fell to Russia, the Circassians did not stay. When Greece and Serbia and Romania became nations, their Muslim populations did not stay. They were killed, or driven out, or left ahead of what they could see coming. And they walked, and they died, on the roads in enormous numbers, and the survivors kept walking, until they reached what was left of the empire. They are called the Muhachir, the refugees. Over the second half of the 19th century, they arrive in Anatolia in the millions. Bosnians, Albanians, Bulgarian Turks, Cretans, Circassians, Tatars. They arrive in a rump state that has no money to feed them, and they settle in Anatolia. And they carry with them a story. And the story is true, and the story is this. We were a majority. Then a Christian nation was invented in our province, with European help. Then we were driven into the sea. That is the population of Anatolia by 1900. That is who is in the villages. That is who is in the officer corps. Remember them. In 15 minutes, they are going to matter more than anything else in this video. Abdulhamid's 30 years are a contradiction that most tellings cannot hold. He built railways, including the Hejaz line to Medina and the Baghdad line with German money. He built schools at every level, and the men who overthrew him were educated in them. He built a telegraph network that reached every province, and he built a police state on top of it. Censorship so thorough that newspapers ran with blank columns. An informer network so large that the reports piled up unread. Exile, imprisonment, and the cultivation of a permanent atmosphere of surveillance in which nobody said anything in public. He modernized the empire and surveilled it with the same wires. That is not a paradox. That is what the technology was for. And in his reign, between 1894 and 1896, came the Hamidian massacres. Armenian communities in eastern Anatolia, in a period of taxation disputes, land seizures, and organized revolutionary agitation, were attacked in a wave of killings across dozens of towns and villages, carried out by irregular Kurdish cavalry regiments the state had organized and armed, by local mobs, and in places by troops. Estimates of the dead run from tens of thousands to well over 100,000. The range is wide, the scholarship is contested, and this video is going to give you the range rather than pick a number for effect. Whatever the figure, it was a state that had decided that its Armenian population was a security problem, and had discovered that violence against them carried no meaningful cost. Europe protested. Europe did nothing. The lesson was learned by everybody watching, and the people watching most carefully were young Ottoman officers who thought Abdulhamid was a disgrace. In July 1908, they moved. Army units in Macedonia mutinied, led by officers of a secret society, and demanded the restoration of the constitution. Abdulhamid, with no reliable force to send, agreed within days. And what happened in the streets of Salonika and Istanbul that summer is one of the most extraordinary scenes in the empire's 600 years. There was dancing, Muslims and Christians and Jews embracing in the street, Greek priests and Muslim clerics and rabbis on the same platforms, newspapers printing whatever they liked for the first time in 3 decades, political prisoners walking out of the jails. A genuine, enormous, unfeigned public belief across every community in the empire that the thing had been saved, that there would be an Ottoman nation of equal citizens, and that it would hold. Every account of that summer describes the same thing. Hope, on a scale the empire had not felt in 100 years. It had 10 years left, and the men dancing in the street are the men who are going to end it. They called themselves the Committee of Union and Progress. They were young. They were officers, doctors, lawyers, journalists. They were educated in Abdul Hamid's own schools, which is one of the recurring jokes of the 19th century, and they had read everything coming out of Paris. They loved the empire with total sincerity, and they intended to save it, and they believed they knew how. And they walked straight into the question that had no answer, the same one that had been sitting in the middle of the room since 1839. On what basis does this state exist? There were 3 answers, and each one killed a third of the empire. Ottomanism said that everyone in the empire is an Ottoman citizen, equal, regardless of religion or language. It was the official answer of 1908, and it was the answer of the men dancing in the street, and it was the honest one, and it had a fatal flaw. Nobody wanted it. The Greeks did not want to be Ottomans, they wanted to be Greeks, and they had a Greece to join. The Bulgarians did not want it. The Armenians, by 1908, had spent 15 years learning what Ottoman citizenship was worth. And the Muslim majority did not want it either, because it meant giving up the last thing they had, which was status. Islamism said the state is the caliphate, the union of Muslims, and that is the glue, which abandons every Christian and Jewish subject the empire has, which is a third of the population and most of the commercial class, and which does not even work on the Muslims, because Albanians and Arabs and Kurds were not interested in being ruled from Istanbul, just because the Sultan was a caliph, and the Arab provinces were already drifting. Turkism said the state is a nation, the Turkish nation, and that is what holds it. It was the newest idea. It was imported from exactly the same European intellectual toolkit that had produced Greek and Serbian nationalism, and it was, in an empire where Turks were a minority of the population, a proposal to shrink the empire to one ethnic group and let the rest go. Every answer costs a third. There is no fourth answer. There never was. The cup tried all 3, in sequence, under pressure, while everything fell apart, and that incoherence is the most honest thing about them, because it fell apart immediately. In 1908, within months of the revolution, Austria formally annexed Bosnia, which it had been administering since 1878, and Bulgaria declared full independence, and Crete declared union with Greece. The constitutional restoration was read by every neighbor as weakness, and they moved. In 1909, a counter-revolution in Istanbul was put down by an army marched from Macedonia, and Abdul Hamid was deposed and put on a train to Salonika, and the cup tightened its grip. In 1911, Italy, which had no grievance and no pretext, and did not bother to invent much of one, invaded Libya, on the reasoning that everyone else was taking pieces and Italy was entitled to one. The Ottomans could not get an army there. They sent officers by disguise and by rail through Egypt to organize a local resistance, and one of them was a young major named Mustafa Kemal, and another was Enver. And then, in October 1912, the roof came off. Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, 4 small states the Ottomans had ruled for 5 centuries and had beaten 100 times, allied and attacked simultaneously. Everyone expected the Ottomans to win. Every military attaché in Europe filed that assessment. In roughly 6 weeks, the Ottoman Empire lost essentially all of its remaining European territory. Understand what that means, and this is where the standard telling fails completely, because it lists the Balkan Wars as one more territorial loss on a long list of territorial losses. This was not the periphery. This was the heartland. The Ottoman Empire had been a European state since the 1360s. Its capital had been in Europe for 90 years before it took Constantinople. Its richest provinces, its best recruiting grounds, its administrative core, its elites' homes were in Rumelia. Salonika, the second city, the birthplace of half the Cup leadership, the city of the 1908 revolution, the Jewish city Bayezid had built with people Spain threw away in 1492. All of it. In 6 weeks. Edirne, the old capital, besieged and taken. The front came within 40 kilometers of Istanbul. Salonika fell to Greece in November 1912. Mustafa Kemal was from Salonika. Talat had worked there. Enver had served there. The Cup was, to a remarkable extent, a Salonika organization, and Salonika was gone, and their families were on the roads. And the roads are the thing. Hundreds of thousands more Muslim refugees came out of the Balkans into Anatolia, in winter, and this time the receiving state was a rump. There were massacres and expulsions in both directions across the whole peninsula, and the Balkans was ethnically resorted by violence in a way it had not been in 5 centuries. And the Muhajir camps around Istanbul in 1913 were a public catastrophe visible from the government offices. Now put the pieces together, because this is the most important paragraph in this video, and it has to be said with total precision. By 1913, the men running the Ottoman Empire were, in large part, men who had personally just lost their homelands, who had watched their own communities driven out, who had spent their childhoods hearing the Muhajir stories from the Caucasus and Bulgaria, and who had now lived their own. And they drew a conclusion from it. The conclusion was that a Christian population inside your borders, with a European sponsor outside them, is not a community. It is a mechanism. It is how you lose a province. Greece was created that way. Serbia was created that way. Bulgaria was created that way. Every one of them started as a millet with a protector. And there was an Armenian population in eastern Anatolia, and Russia was on the other side of the border. That is not a justification. There is no justification, and this video is not offering one. And anyone who tells you the Balkan Wars, explain what happened next, in the sense of excusing it, is lying to you. It is a mechanism. It is how a group of intelligent, educated, modernizing men, who genuinely believed they were saving something, reasoned their way to the worst crime in the empire's history. And if you do not understand the mechanism, you learn nothing from it. And the only reason to spend 2.5 hours on a dead empire is to learn something from it. In 1913, the Cup took absolute power in a coup, and by 1914, the empire was effectively run by 3 men. Enver at war, Talat at the interior, Jamal at the navy and then Syria. Enver was 32 years old. The alliance with Germany was made by a handful of men, in secret, at speed, and most of the cabinet did not know. The empire had been shopping for a European guarantor since the 1830s, because it had understood since Mahmud that survival meant a sponsor, and Britain and France had spent 30 years demonstrating that they would rather manage the estate than defend it. Britain had just seized 2 battleships the Ottoman public had paid for by popular subscription, school children donating coins, and kept them. Germany was the only bidder, and Enver was a Germanophile, and it was done. Then 2 German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, being chased through the Mediterranean by the Royal Navy, ran for the Dardanelles and were let in. To finesse the neutrality problem, the Ottomans announced they had bought them. The German crews stayed aboard. They put fezzes on. And in October 1914, those ships, under a German admiral, flying the Ottoman flag, sailed into the Black Sea and shelled Russian ports. The Ottoman Empire was at war before its own government had agreed to it, because a small group of men engineered a fait accompli with somebody else's navy. The war goes like this. In December 1914, Enver, who had never commanded anything larger than a division and who had decided he was Napoleon, personally led an army into the Caucasus Mountains in winter to encircle the Russians at Sarakamush. The men had no winter equipment. The temperatures went to 30 below. The encirclement failed, and the army was destroyed, and the majority of the dead did not die in combat. They froze. Casualty estimates vary enormously and run into the tens of thousands, most of an army gone in a month for nothing. Enver came back and blamed the Armenians. In April 1915, the British and French landed at Gallipoli to force the Straits, take Istanbul, and knock the empire out of the war in a stroke. Churchill's plan. And on that peninsula, the Ottoman army did the last great thing it would ever do. They held for 8 months against the British Empire, the French, the Australians, and the New Zealanders. The Allies never got off the beaches in any meaningful sense. In January 1916, they evacuated, and the evacuation was the most competently executed part of the entire operation. And out of Gallipoli came a name. A lieutenant colonel named Mustafa Kemal, commanding at Chunuk Bair and Konk Bayeri, who reportedly told his men that he was not ordering them to attack, but ordering them to die, and that in the time it took them to die, other forces would arrive. It made him a national figure. Remember the shape of this. The man who becomes famous saving the empire is the man who is going to abolish it. In 1916 at Kut, in Mesopotamia, an entire British and Indian army, under General Townshend, was besieged and surrendered. 13,000 men went into captivity. It was one of the worst defeats in British military history to that point. So the empire was not collapsing militarily. That is the thing people miss. It was fighting on 4 fronts against 3 great powers, and it was holding. And in the middle of that, in 1915, it destroyed its Armenian population. On the 24th of April 1915, in Constantinople, several hundred Armenian intellectuals, writers, doctors, lawyers, editors, and community leaders were arrested. Most were deported, and most were killed. That date is the one Armenians mark, and it marks the removal of the leadership, which is always the first step. In May, the Tehcir law authorized deportation. What deportation meant, in practice, is documented in enormous detail by German officers who were the Ottomans' own allies and who wrote appalled reports back to Berlin, by American diplomats including the ambassador Henry Morgenthau, by missionaries, by survivors, and by the Ottoman state's own telegraph traffic, some of which was later used in Ottoman courts-martial in 1919. The men were separated out and killed first, usually within days, usually near the town. The women, children, and elderly were marched, not transported, marched, on foot, for weeks, south and east, into the Syrian desert, without food, without water, without shelter, under guard by irregular units, many of them convicts released from prison for the purpose, organized under a body called the Special Organization. They were attacked on the road. They were robbed, raped, and killed in numbers, by the guards and by tribes along the route. Children were taken. Those who survived the march arrived at camps in the desert, at Deir ez-Zor and elsewhere, where there was nothing, and where the survivors of the survivors were killed in 1916. Somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million Armenians died. The range is the range the scholarship gives, and this video will give the range rather than pick a number. Assyrian Christians were killed and deported in the same period, in the same way, in numbers in the hundreds of thousands. Ottoman Greeks, in Pontus and along the coasts, the same. These are almost always left out, and leaving them out is not a simplification, it is an inaccuracy. Now the wording, because it matters, and this video is going to be precise about it, rather than slippery. The consensus among historians of the period, and the formal position of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, is that this was genocide. It is the case that the word genocide itself was coined by Raphael Lemkin with this specifically in mind, alongside the Holocaust. The Republic of Turkey officially rejects that characterization. Its position, consistently held, is that these were wartime deportations with terrible mortality from disease, famine, and civil conflict, in a period in which Muslims also died in enormous numbers, and that it does not meet the definition. Both of those facts are true statements about the world. There is a scholarly consensus. There is a state that denies it. Those are not two sides of a historical debate. One is a body of research, and the other is a government position, and this video is going to report them as what they are, and not launder the second into the first, and then say nothing else, because at this point in the story, adjectives are a way of avoiding facts, and the facts are sufficient. The rest goes fast. In 1916, the Arab Revolt began, with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, British gold, British rifles, and a British liaison officer named Lawrence. The custodianship of the holy cities, the thing Selim had taken in 1517, ended with the Sharif of Mecca in arms against the Caliph. And in the same year, in London, a British civil servant named Mark Sykes and a French diplomat named François-Georges Picot sat down with a map and divided the Ottoman Arab provinces between Britain and France, in secret, while the Ottoman Empire still held every inch of them, and while Britain was simultaneously promising Arab independence to Hussein and, in 1917, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine to Lord Rothschild. Three incompatible promises about the same ground. The Bolsheviks found the Sykes-Picot text in the Tsarist archives in 1917 and published it out of spite, and every Arab ally of the British learned at the same moment, from a Russian newspaper, exactly what the promises had been worth. Look at a map of the modern Middle East, and you are looking at that room. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the lines are there. Almost every one of them is still on the map, and almost every war along them since has been an argument with two men and a pencil. In October 1918, the Ottomans signed the armistice at Mudros. Days later, the triumvirate, Enver, Talat, and Cemal, boarded a German ship at night and left. All three were eventually assassinated abroad by Armenian gunmen in an operation called Nemesis. In November 1918, an Allied fleet, 60-odd warships, anchored off Constantinople and occupied the city. It was the first time a foreign army had held that city since the 29th of May, 1453, 465 years. And then, in 1920, the Allies produced the Treaty of Sèvres, and Sèvres is where they overreached so badly that they created the thing they were trying to prevent. Sèvres did not partition the provinces. The provinces were gone. Sèvres partitioned Anatolia, the Turkish heartland, a French zone, an Italian zone, a Greek zone around Smyrna, with a referendum to follow that everyone understood was a formality, an independent Armenia in the east, autonomous Kurdistan, the Straits under permanent international control with a foreign commission, the finances under Allied supervision, the army capped at 50,000 men, and in the middle of it, a rump sultanate around Istanbul supervised. The Sultan's government signed it. And that signature is what killed the Ottoman Empire, because it made the Sultanate indefensible to the only people left who could fight. In Anatolia, there was an officer corps that had survived Gallipoli. There were Muhachir populations who had already been driven out of one homeland and had nowhere further to go. There were arms depots, and there was Mustafa Kemal, who had landed at Samsun in May 1919, nominally on the Sultan's business, and had immediately started building a rival government at Ankara. Sèvres handed him every argument he needed. The Sultan had signed away Anatolia. Therefore the Sultan was finished. Therefore, the nation must save itself. The Greco-Turkish War ran from 1919 to 1922, and the Greek army pushed deep into Anatolia and was stopped at the Sakarya River in 1921 and broken at Dumlupinar in 1922. In September 1922, the Turkish army entered Smyrna, and Smyrna burned. Responsibility for the fire is contested to this day, and this video is going to leave it contested, because the sources are irreconcilable, and everyone who claims certainty has a flag. What is not contested is that the Greek and Armenian quarters were destroyed, that tens of thousands died, that hundreds of thousands were evacuated from the waterfront by ships that watched for days, and that 3,000 years of Greek presence in Anatolia ended in that harbor. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne replaced Sèvres, recognized the Republic of Turkey in the borders it had won, and ended the occupation. And Lausanne contained a clause, negotiated between the parties, endorsed by the League of Nations, celebrated at the time by respectable people as a humane and modern solution to the problem of minorities. The compulsory exchange of populations. Roughly 1.2 million Orthodox Christians were removed from Anatolia to Greece. Roughly 400,000 Muslims were removed from Greece to Turkey. Compulsory. By treaty. Sorted by religion, not by language. So that Turkish-speaking Christians who did not speak a word of Greek were sent to Greece, and Greek-speaking Muslims from Crete, who did not speak a word of Turkish, were sent to Turkey. Most of them had never seen the country they were sent to. Many families had been in their villages for 500, 800, 2,000 years. That is the end of the millet system. 400 years of communities living beside each other under an empire that had, whatever else it did, kept them there. Undone by treaty, in an afternoon, by an international community that considered it progress. And Salonika. Salonika is Greek now, and the Muslims are gone with the exchange. And the Jewish community, the one Bayezid's ships brought out of Spain in 1492, the one that made it a majority Jewish city for 400 years, the one that spoke 15th century Spanish in the street into the 20th century, is still there. In 1943, the Germans deported them. Somewhere in the region of 50,000 people went to Auschwitz, and around 95% did not come back. That is not this video's story, and it does not belong to the Ottomans. But a community that survived 5 centuries under a Muslim empire and did not survive 4 years under a European one is a fact, and leaving it out to keep the ending tidy would be a lie by omission. Now the last morning. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara passed a law abolishing the Sultanate. Not a battle, not a siege, a vote. 623 years, 36 sultans, an unbroken male line from a man on a frontier in 1299, and it ended with a show of hands in a converted schoolhouse in a provincial town in the middle of Anatolia. Mehmed VI, the 36th Sultan, Caliph of Islam, custodian of the 2 holy mosques, heir of Osman and of Mehmed the Conqueror and of Suleiman, was in the Dolmabahce Palace, on the Bosphorus, in an occupied city, with no government, no army, and no money. On the 17th of November, 1922, before dawn, in the rain, he left the palace by a side entrance, with a small suitcase and a handful of servants, got into an ambulance to avoid being recognized, and was driven to the waterfront, where a British warship, HMS Malaya, was waiting. He boarded it as a private passenger, The last sultan of the Ottoman Empire left his capital as a guest of the navy that had occupied it at 5 in the morning in an ambulance so that nobody would see. He died in exile in Italy in 1926, and his creditors seized his coffin over unpaid bills. On the 3rd of March 1924, the caliphate was abolished. The office that Selim had acquired in 1517, that had been the leadership of Sunni Islam for 400 years, was closed by legislation. The entire house of Osman, every member, was exiled from Turkey and given days to leave. Some of them died in poverty in Beirut and Paris. The final descendants were not permitted to return for decades. And here is the last fact, and it is the one this entire video has been walking towards since the first sentence. No enemy army marched into Constantinople to end the Ottoman Empire. The British were sitting in the harbor, and they did not do it. The Greeks tried and failed. The Russians had wanted it for 200 years and never got there. Timur deleted it, and it came back. 23 armies broke on those walls. It was ended by Turks, in Ankara, by a vote, on the argument, which was correct, that the empire was now the only thing standing between the Turkish nation and its survival. The Ottoman Empire was not destroyed by an enemy. It was destroyed by the effort to survive. Go back to the beginning. A man on a frontier, around 1300, with no documents, whose founding story was written by his descendants a century and a half after he died, because there was nothing else to write it from. And the question at the top of this video, why can nobody name what it left behind? Here is the answer. Because it left everything behind, and all of it is filed under other names. Look at a map. The Ottoman Empire does not have a successor state. It has about 30 of them. Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Romania, Hungary in part, Ukraine in part, Georgia, and Armenia in part, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Yemen, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Cyprus. Now look at where the arguments are. Bosnia, Cyprus. The Kurdish question, which is a line Sèvres promised and Lausanne deleted. The Sunni and Shia frontier through Iraq, which is roughly where Selim's guns stopped in 1514. The borders of Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Jordan, which are a British civil servant and a French diplomat and a pencil in 1916. Jerusalem, held by that empire for 400 years and promised twice in 18 months by a third party that did not own it. There is not one Ottoman Empire on the map. There are 30 fragments of one, and most of the fault lines running through the modern world between Vienna and Basra are the seams where the pieces came apart. It is not gone, it is distributed, and that is why you cannot name it. A thing that becomes everything becomes invisible. The empire that spent 6 centuries absorbing and refusing to make anyone become Ottoman, that let every community keep its own name and its own god and its own language, ended up leaving nothing that carries its name, because it never asked anything to. That was the strength. A state that does not need you to be like it can rule you for 400 years, and that was the death. A state that never made anyone Ottoman had nobody to defend it, when the century decided that everyone had to be something. The footstool in the living room is not a joke. It is the last honest thing. Europe took the seating and kept the word, and forgot the country, which is exactly what the Ottomans did to everyone else for 600 years, and it is exactly what everyone else finally did back. So the last image is the first one. Osman, on a frontier, in 1300, with no documents, no decree, no letter, no signature. A founder who left no evidence that he was ever there. And Mehmed VI, 623 years later, at 5 in the morning, in the rain, in an ambulance, boarding a foreign warship as a private passenger with one suitcase, so that nobody would watch him go. The House of Osman ended exactly the way it began, undocumented, in the dark, on a boat nobody saw leave.